Georgios, Malini, thank you very much for joining us.
Hello, hi there.
Hello, good to hear you. Cannot see you yet. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for joining us earlier.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fine. I'm actually just checking my internet connection also. I may switch to my phone.
All right.
So when this says this is, my connection is unstable. So let me just change now.
Sure. Georgios, would you like to check your audio and video?
So Marie, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you well, yes.
I think what I'll do, it seems fine for now. In case it becomes unstable, then what I will do is I will switch to my phone connection. And that means that I will temporarily be dropping off, but then I will reconnect. Okay?
All right, okay. Now it's perfectly fine.
Okay.
Thanks. Georgios, can I ask you to check your audio and video, if possible?
Yes, could you hear me?
Yes. Good morning. Good afternoon.
Hi. I had an exchange with Julia at 1. It looked well.
Okay. That's perfect.
She will use. She will help me in showing my presentation.
Perfect.
So it seems under control. Everything is fine. Thanks again.
It's totally fine. Thank you so much.
Very good. How is? Can you see me well?
Georgios, we can see you perfectly well. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thanks a lot.
Hello, everyone. Hello to all the participants. Thank you once again for joining the second day of the Inter-Paris Global Virtual Conference, Catalysing Parliamentary Action to Fight Climate Change. My name is Elena Botanina, and I'm pleased to be your Master of Ceremonies today. For those who didn't join us yesterday, I would like to remind you that Inter-Paris, Parliaments in Partnership, EU Global Project to strengthen the capacity of parliaments is the first global parliamentary project of its kind. Funded by the European Union and implemented by International IDEA, its purpose is to strengthen the capacity of parliaments in partner countries by enhancing their legislative, oversight, representative, budgetary, and administrative functions. With one of our cross-cutting priorities on climate change and environmental protection, together with the EU member state parliaments and our partner parliaments, we have organized this conference, which shares best European and international practices and lessons learned on parliamentary action on climate change. We're very pleased to welcome you all. And before we start with the first intervention, we just would like to remind you a couple of housekeeping rules. So I would like to remind you that we have interpretation today in English, French, and Spanish. If you have any technical questions or issues, please write them in chat and our team will be pleased to help you. At the end of each session, we will have a Q&A part and you will be able to ask your questions to speakers via the Q&A box. I also remind you that the conference is broadcast and recorded via our YouTube channel, and you can also find the recording of the first day of the conference there as well. We encourage you to share your thoughts and ideas on the conference using Parliament for Climate hashtag, and also please tag our social media channels. We do not want to spend too much time introducing our respected speakers, but we would like to still share their amazing biographies with you. So you can find speakers' bios on our website, and the direct link will be available in chat as well. And we want to kick off today's conference, the second day of the conference, with a video message from Virginijus Sinkevicius, European Commissioner for the Environment and Oceans and Fisheries, who unfortunately wasn't able to join us in person today, but he sends best regards to all of you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the second day of the conference. Today is about European action, about democracy, and about engaging citizens. As a former parliamentarian myself, these topics are close to my heart. If you want effective action for the longer term, you need democratic legitimacy. You need a representative process to put the right framework in place and to sell these ideas to the people. That takes a close relationship with citizens built on trust. And on that, I'm sure you can deliver. Under the von der Leyen Commission, the European Green Deal is our framework for action. It is an effort to tackle crisis in a systemic manner. It's a deal to heal nature, to restructure the economy and to put us on a path to growth. Under its broad umbrella, we have adopted detailed strategies and proposals for legislation. The climate law is now agreed, with a path to climate neutrality by 2050. We now have a new climate target for 2030, reducing emissions by at least 55%. But the Green Deal isn't just about climate. It's an approach that always looks for multiple wins. The circular economy is a good example. Our current industrial model is a relic from the past. It drives up emissions, it uses up resources, and it's harming the nature we depend on. In a circular economy, we turn that around. We cut our use of virgin resources, we use cleaner inputs to the manufacturing process, and we keep our materials in circulation for longer. The result is good for economy, but it also means lower emissions, relief for the planet, and better quality of life. Climate and biodiversity are another example. When we bring those policies together, we enter a virtuous circle. Ambitious reduction targets for carbon means easing the pressure on our ecosystems. And more robust ecosystems will draw down more carbon. That's why our biodiversity strategy calls for higher targets, for 30% protection of our lands and seas. By restoring wetlands and peatlands and sustainably managing forests and soils, we aren't just protecting nature. We are building up our carbon sinks and slowing the process of climate change. And with stronger protection for the seas, we are stepping up action for the oceans, the biggest carbon sinks on the planet. For world leaders, 2021 is a year of major decisions. Both the Climate COP in Glasgow and the Biodiversity COP in Kunming should deliver lasting change, agreements that set a clear path to a sustainable future. Those agreements will draw up the broad lines, but the details will come down to you. Because when the world needs action on the ground, it looks to its parliaments. You give these issues the oxygen they need. With your careful scrutiny, you identify problems before they happen, and you find the policies that make a difference to citizens' lives. Parliaments are indispensable. So when it comes to the Green Deal, I will always be very happy to work hand in hand with you, the representatives of the people. Thank you.
We thank very much the Commissioner for his introductory video. And now for the keynote speech, I would like to invite Saber Chowdhury, Chairman of the Parliamentary Committee on Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change at the Bangladesh Parliament and former President of Inter-Parliamentary Union. Saber, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elena. And it's wonderful to be in a forum, albeit virtually, with parliamentarians from the EU and also from around the world. Thank you for inviting me, and let me also express my gratitude and appreciation to the organizers. Of course, international ideas and ably assisted by the European Union, and also all of those who have worked behind the scenes to make the first day a great success. I have been asked to deliver a keynote. I'm not sure how many notes I'll have in my speech, and it's not really a speech. It's more a conversation with people who I believe have potential, which is perhaps sometimes underestimated, and potential that can certainly be put to far greater use. You introduced today's events by referring to the hashtag, which is Parliaments for Climate. I would like to make it Parliaments for, and then the C will stand for change rather than climate. So how can parliamentarians be change agents? How can they deliver change? I think that is really what we are talking about when we talk about parliamentary engagement and parliamentary action. Before I go into the substance of what I'm going to share, let me also join all of you, as you have done over the last few days, talk about President Nasheed, now of course Speaker Nasheed. I actually first met him during the course of COP15. There was an event which was hosted at the Danish Parliament, And I heard him speak there for the first time. That was on the sidelines of COP15. And we have been friends ever since, in good days and bad days. And very recently, we have teamed up together to form a parliamentary front to the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which represents 48 countries, around 1.2 billion people from around the world. So we certainly wish him well, and I'm sure, being the fighter he is, he's going to be back amongst us sooner rather than later, and we wish him a speedy recovery. If I may just give you a context to today's sharing of thoughts, and not so much a speech as I've mentioned earlier. I think the substance as well as the timing is very important. We know that climate change is an issue of overriding concern. It's an existential threat, as we have talked about it. And also the timing in terms of the Leader Summit that President Biden recently convened, and of course the upcoming Biodiversity Convention, as well as the COP26 in Glasgow. So I think we are having this discussion in a new context for multilateralism, which unfortunately over the last 5 years has been in the critical care unit. But now I think with the US back, they are showing higher ambitions, and the EU has come forward, Japan has come forward. I think there is a real opportunity for adding a parliamentary component and a dimension to this new multilateral initiative and approach in global politics. So I think that's why also it is very important. Now, before the Madrid COP, I know there were a spate of climate emergencies that were declared by various parliaments. Of course, we had it initially in Scotland, Wales, England, and then it was Gibraltar, Portugal, France, Argentina, so many other countries. And even the European Parliament also declared a climate emergency just before the Madrid COP. Now, what you see on the screen is in fact not a climate emergency motion, but it's called a planetary emergency. And I use this as context because it's not just a climate crisis. It is also related to the biodiversity loss. It is also related to extreme weather events. It is relating to food security. It is relating to water stress, how we use our resources. So for us as parliamentarians, one of the things we always try to do is to see things in a broader frame, in a broader context. And how we connect the dots as parliamentarians is also very important. So in Bangladesh, we adopted this parliamentary resolution, which covers not just climate, but the whole gamut of the crisis which is brewing in the horizon. In fact, it's like a perfect storm. If you look at 2050, we are looking at climate neutrality, but we also have to fix all of the other crises. And so when we talk about opportunity for parliamentarians, it is not just to fix the climate crisis, but also to see how it interrelates and how the linkages are in terms of biodiversity and all of the other challenges that you see. And as you see there, we are talking about the urgency, we are talking about 1.5 degrees Celsius. And we know that we have already reached 1.2 degrees Celsius warming. So the margin for us, or the cushion, is almost minimal. So that is really where the urgency of the situation comes in, because otherwise, whatever we do is going to be too little too late. And the other thing that we are trying to do through this planetary emergency motion, I think the slide, you can take that off. I can move the slide, please. Is really to talk about how parliamentarians are going to function in this new order, if you like. And when we talk about parliamentary engagement, when we talk about parliamentary responsibilities, we have all heard about legislation. We hear about allocation of resources through the budgetary process. We talk about oversight. We talk about policy. But here, I think what we are talking about is leadership. It is not just oversight in terms of seeing what the government has done with the resources that we have allocated. It is also to lay a path for the future. It is to take a broader view. And remember, one of the challenges we have when we look at global issues is that one is that they're global, of course, in terms of geographical scope. The other is the timeline. So if you look at the climate, the Paris Agreement, you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, you're looking at timelines for 15 years, 20 years, 25 years. Now, the challenge comes in when governments respond to that global ambition and aspiration, because they always think in terms of their election cycle. It's either 4 years or 5 years. because that's how they are going to be judged, what they do over this period. So the longer term perspective is missing. So this is where we can really add value. And I have found that parliamentarians are far more receptive to taking this longer term view than governments are. And I think this is one area where we should certainly focus. At the same time, I think what is important is that, if you look at the Montesquieu trinity of the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive, all three are supposed to work in a mutual check and balance. And ultimately, that mutual check and balance delivers what the people want and what is best for the people. So unless we play our roles in that regard, and here I'm talking about the parliamentary community in a global context. So we as parliamentarians must have what I refer to as independence of thought. We cannot be mouthpieces of the government or the executive. We cannot simply say or repeat in parrot fashion what they are saying. We must have our own perspectives because that's what we have been elected to serve. And I think this is very important because if we don't do that, then the space around us as parliamentarians and as the institution of parliament is actually going to shrink. And we are going to become subservient to the executive. So that is very important, those mutual checks and balances. Now, I know that we are putting a lot on the plate of parliamentarians, whether it is, cyberspace, whether it is human security, whether it is the oceans. Parliamentarians have a full agenda. Now, we can keep putting agenda on the plate of the parliamentarians. Now we have the Sustainable Development Goals, which also includes climate. But we must also look at what is the capacity of the parliaments to deliver. Because democracy only works when democracy delivers. If democracy doesn't deliver, if the people see that the problems are not being fixed through a democratic system, then they lose trust and faith in democracy. So, we must deliver. And for us to deliver, what we, in fact, thought of, and this was done in 2015 and 2016, is the Interparliamentary Union. And I know Martin Kyungong, the Secretary General, spoke yesterday on behalf of the IPU. And there's a rich collaboration between the IPU and ideas, is that we came up with a self-assessment toolkit. So before we actually undertake more responsibility, we have to see to what extent are we capable of responding to the aspirations of the people? To what extent are we, if you like, to put it very bluntly, fit for purpose, which is also something very important. And so this self-assessment toolkit actually guides you through that process. It's a voluntary thing that parliaments can do because the last thing you want is an external agency to come and tell parliaments that this is where you are lagging and this is what you need to do. So it's a self-evaluation kit. And I would encourage all parliaments to actually go through that. And then what you can do is you can do benchmarking. You can see where your strengths are. You can see where your weaknesses are. You can see where you need to put in more resources. And I think so capacity building without actually understanding the needs is not going to mean much. So yes, this inter pares, I think, initiative of building capacity is important, but it has to be relevant to the needs and relevant to our own individual capacities. And there's no one size that fits all. So I think this is also something which is very, very important. And from it comes the ability to decide how we actually allocate resources prudently and how we judge governments, not just in terms of how much money has been spent, but what is the impact that we have achieved by spending that money? That is looking at it from a qualitative impact. And I mentioned something at the beginning that, sometimes we underestimate our power. To me, what is not the power, but what is our ability, or where do we get the ability to change or shape events? And I refer to the 3 Ps. So if you like, the power of the 3 Ps that we as parliamentarians have. So one is the power of the purse. We allocate the resources. So let us not underestimate that ability that we have. We have the power of policy. We can shape policy because when we talk about legislation has to be in context of policies, and legislation then is giving expression to that policy. And finally, the power of pronouncements, which is the 3rd P. Because what we say in the public domain, how we engage with our constituents, how we motivate them, how we enlighten them, how we increase their awareness, not just in terms of holding governments to account, but also to see what they can do in terms of fighting climate change. It is at the end of the day, individuals who matter. So engaging with citizens, not just to hold governments to account, but also inspiring the citizens to act in a way which is going to be ultimately beneficial. So I think we have all of those issues. Now I know that we are going on in time. How am I doing, Elena, for time? How much? I don't want to go on for too long. Okay, let me make one final point. That relates to what can we do? We have Glasgow coming up. So after Glasgow, and I think Glasgow is going to be the COP that is going to seal the targets. We don't want to talk about ambitions anymore. We don't want to talk about pledges. We want to see results. We want to see delivery of the pledges. And so Joe Biden hosted a leader summit. I think that's a great idea that he did that. Prior to that, the UN Secretary General in December of 2020 had a summit. He called it the Ambition Summit. Now we have to move from ambition to accountability. So I would actually propose that as parliamentarians, we get together and in 2022, we can organize an accountability summit where we look at what has actually been delivered. How many fossil fuel companies have been defunded? How many coal-fired power plants have been decommissioned? How much money has gone into renewables? How our ecosystems much more resilient? To what extent are we healing nature? I think we as parliamentarians are really fit and capable to do that work. Now, of course, when you talk about climate accountability at a national level, it is always challenging and it is also very sensitive because the UN has moral authority, but the UN cannot compel a member state to do something. So I think that's where we as parliamentarians, because we have moral and we also have constitutional authority, that's where the accountability mechanism can really come in. And I think if we can do an accountability summit before the global stocktake, which is due for 2023, as per the Paris Agreement, I think it will be a wonderful contribution that we as parliamentarians are going to make. So before I end, my main message today is how can we inspire change? Not cosmetic change, but change that delivers. And through that delivery, how can we ensure that people's faith in democracy and the institutions that underpin democracy are in fact further strengthened? I think that's really what we are looking at. So we have to be change agents. We have to challenge the status quo. We have to push the boundaries of innovation, of cooperation, of partnerships. And I think by doing that, we will have done a great justice to the people that we represent. And we will also have been truthful to the oath that we take as members of parliament. Thank you so much, Elena.
Thank you so much, Saber, for your articulate and impactful speech, and also for joining us at very late hour. I know it's quite late for you, and also for your kind words to the Honorable Speaker Mohammed Nasheed. We also wish him a very speedy recovery. Before we continue and start with the next session, I would like to remind all the participants that we have 4 sessions today on European action on climate change, parliaments and the sustainable development goals, regional and global parliamentary action, and the last but not least, engaging citizens in decision-making on climate. I think few of these things were mentioned in Saber Chadbury's speech. And now for the first session of today, which focuses on the European action on climate change, I would like to introduce you to Katja Biedenkopf, Associate Professor with the Sustainable Futures Research Group at KU Leuven in Belgium. Thank you very much, Katja, for joining us.
Okay, thank you. Do I have the floor?
Yes, you.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, I was not expecting to have to do this so quickly. I would like to share my screen, and I'm trying to do it as quickly as I can. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this panel. And I do hope that you now can see my screen. I just prepared very few slides on the European Parliament and climate policy. So we'll focus on Europe and the European Parliament in this panel. And what I'd like to do is to, well, maybe give a bit of an introductory talk or presentation to then the two other presentations who really have worked or still work in the European Parliament. If we look at the European Parliament, the first question that arises to me is, to what extent is it actually similar or the same to national parliaments, and or to what extent is it a special case? And there indeed are some particular aspects of the European Parliament that distinguish it a bit from other national parliaments, and certainly the national parliaments in many EU member states, but also a number of other countries. And one aspect is that the relationship between the European Parliament and the Commission, the European Commission, is actually a bit more indirect than you would see in many countries, and certainly in majoritarian systems where the majority of Parliament elects the government. In the EU, we don't necessarily have a majority in Parliament for the proposals by the Commission. And also, well, if we look at the Council, it doesn't necessarily always agree with it. So the Parliament, to some extent, actually is a bit more independent in the political process than you would expect or see in many countries. So I think we should keep that in mind. The Parliament has been very active, but it also has been active because of the special institutional architecture of the European Union. And so maybe not as a surprise, or maybe as a surprise, what we've seen over the course of the past decades is that the European Parliament tends to be more ambitious on climate policy than the Council of Ministers, and also the European Council, which has become a bit more active on climate policy in recent years. So there's some very good research by, for example, Charlotte Burns from the UK, who really has traced how ambitious the European Parliament is, how it has driven European environmental and climate policy. And although over the course of the years, the Parliament has become maybe a bit less ambitious, it still is more ambitious than the Council. And I think this reduction of ambitiousness can also be explained by the Parliament actually having assumed a much more prominent role in the lawmaking process in the EU. So the Parliament actually is co-legislator with the Council on most, if not all, climate policies. But what the Parliament has always used is not just its formal influence, but also its informal influence. So maybe that's something where we can find some of the innovations that can also inspire other parliamentarians and other parliaments. So, for example, in foreign policy, where the European Parliament has fewer competences than in internal policies, it often uses informal influence or informal ways to nonetheless engage very much in, well, in this case, foreign climate policy. And one element, for example, links very much to the keynote that we just listened to. And this idea of adding a parliamentary element to global climate governance, to the negotiations, is actually something that the European Parliament certainly has already identified as an area of activity where formally it's not part of the EU negotiation team, but nonetheless it's part of the EU delegation to the international COPs and tries to interact and act as an international actor as well. So this is certainly something where the Parliament has been very active. If we look at green parties, just to give you a bit of a background, actually the Parliament has become greener. We've looked at the past European elections. Since '89, there actually are green parties in the European Parliament. And if we look at where they come from and how many there are, actually in 2019, we've seen quite a success for the green parties. But what we also see is that they don't come from each of the member states equally. We certainly see that the Eastern member or Central European member states don't have or don't send as many, if any at all. Green MEPs to the European Parliament, while certainly in Germany they had a big success, but also in a number of other countries more in the center of the EU. So certainly geographically, we rather see maybe a divide, or we see some differences that should be kept in mind. It's not necessarily representative for all member states equally, and that sometimes also plays out when we look at whether MEPs vote according to political group lines, which normally they do, or whether national interests actually also play a role. Very briefly, this is something from a very recent research that we've done looking into climate ambition. So what we've done here is basically looking at plenary debates and coding how ambitious MEPs are in their speeches. And what we see, not surprisingly, quite a left-right divide, so a clear divide across the political groups. And the more right parties are advocate low position, while overall really confirm what others have found already. The European Parliament tends to be quite ambitious or advocate high ambition for climate policy. If we look at their arguments, and I think that's more interesting for a debate about what kind of climate policy is or should be done, where are we headed in the future. What we've done in the analysis of these debates is we looked at different arguments that MEPs use. And we initially actually expected that those who advocate for low climate ambition would say, yes, we risk our competitiveness, and that is bad for Europe. So that's why we should not be ambitious. And then it's the third line of that figure, if you want to have a look. But what we actually found is that certainly this concern about risking competitiveness also played a role in the arguments of those who advocate for high ambition. And they would then say, okay, yes, we actually risk our competitiveness if it's only the EU who engages in high climate ambition and the others don't. So we really need to engage with others. We need to encourage, compel, force other countries to also increase their climate ambition. And this is really something that we see increase over the years. And so I think that explains also why we're now talking about a carbon border adjustment, for example, in the European Union. So really, this international dimension has risen, and also the policy proposals or the policy instruments that are being proposed have changed and have maybe moved more into a bit more coercive kind of policy instruments as well. The other argument, which was used also by those who advocate for high ambition as well as for low ambition, but in a different with a different line of argumentation, is that the EU is less responsible for climate change than others. And this very much reflects that, well, we've been successful in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and other countries have increased their greenhouse gas emissions. So overall, the EU accounts for, I think it's around 8% of global emissions. And that was seen as actually almost a problem from the EU perspective. So we don't necessarily have that much power anymore. Others are more responsible for causing climate change and should therefore also act. So again, this really trying to not only look at our domestic climate policy, but being concerned about the international dimension was quite prominent. So these were just two arguments that we found and that were quite interesting, and I think tell us something about also the kinds of policies that we see and that we will see in the future, and the lines along which MEPs think. I won't go into more detail of the other arguments. And so what we also see, and this is just a second strand that I want to highlight, but I know that other panelists will go into more detail, is that we also see not only a move towards the international dimension, really being concerned about competitiveness, but also internally, we really see a move from seeing climate policy as more, as a single policy, as one sector, to really integrating climate policy into all other policy areas virtually. So the Parliament certainly has pushed for integration of climate concerns in the budget and a number of other policies. And this is really very much expressed in the European Green Deal, which really tries to combine different aspects, tries to achieve climate goals by making it compatible or harnessing other areas, social areas, economic areas, finances, and the like. So just one last reflection with which I want to conclude, and that's the challenges that the European Parliament is facing, and I hope we can maybe have a bit of a discussion about that. So that's one aspect internally. The context in Europe is changing. I showed you the election results, so we see the Green parties gaining more votes, but we don't see that in all countries. We see in a number of countries populist parties gaining more votes. So we actually see a bit more of a polarization within the parliament. So far, we haven't seen that being translated into a change on climate policy, but populism's rifts among member states could potentially in the future actually polarize the European Parliament, which could weaken it in a sense of maybe not being able to decide or to be such a strong and coherent voice in the climate debate as it has been so far. And what I think is very important in that regard is the concept of just transition. And the European Parliament very much has coined that phrase, also has pushed for it quite early. And I think if we don't want to make climate policy something of the elite, if we don't want to give space to populists to use or abuse the climate topic, then those issues are very important, and they're very much integrated and a pillar of the European Green Deal. So integrating the social aspect with the climate aspect, making climate policy fair towards every member state and every citizen within every member state. So I think this is really an area where we should pay enough attention, to which we should pay enough attention, and I have the impression we do, or many MEPs actually do. The other last aspect with which I want to conclude is the changing international context. Well, we had elections in the US, which actually, from my perspective at least, brought a positive change. And so internationally, the cards are mixed again and have been shuffled again and are now better for ambitious action. We have the US on board again, which of course is a very different context, but it also shows how vulnerable it is. Other elections could bring changes again, and this very much links to this concern of competitiveness loss, which I mentioned, which is quite vivid in the debate. So this is a challenge that we certainly should not lose sight of. And I haven't looked at the time, but I think I've almost used my 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katja, for your excellent presentation. I will just move directly to the next speaker. It's Satu Hassi, Chair of the Grant Committee at the Finnish Parliament. Satu, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks very much for the invitation for this conference. May I have my first slide right on? Yes, I try to explain how the European action on climate is seen in and influenced by in the Finnish Parliament. I have myself been in the Finnish Parliament for 20 years and for 10 years in the European Parliament. And at the moment I'm chairing the Grant Committee, the EU, so to say, EU Committee of the Parliament, and the previous term I was chairing the Environment Committee. Anyway, the Finnish Parliament has a fairly strong role in forming Finland's position in EU decision-making, because the Finnish government needs the position of the Parliament before the Finnish minister goes to EU Council to take decisions. The Parliament decides the Finnish position on all such issues where the national legislation falls to the mandate of the Parliament. And everything linked to climate policy falls to that category. And in the Parliament, it's the Grand Committee that decides the position of the Parliament. And this decision is politically binding for, for the government. Every time when the European Commission produces a new legislative proposal, the government is obliged to give a memorandum to the Parliament, at least within 6 weeks, and preferably, of course, more rapidly. And the government then outlines if it supports the proposal or not, how the proposal would change various fields of economy and policy, and what kinds of amendments would be needed. Then special committees of the Parliament look at the issue in more detail, and they give their opinions to the Grand Committee. And on climate-related issues, climate legislation and climate policy documents, the responsible committee is the Environment Committee. But many times also, in most cases, also other committees give their opinions, like for example, the Commerce Committee, which is responsible for energy policy, and the Committee for Agriculture and Forestry, and the Committee of Transport. And after all relevant special committees have given their positions or opinions, then the Grand Committee decides the position of the Parliament, which is politically binding for the government, as I already said. So this is the formal procedure, but of course, there are like more political ways of influencing issues, and I would like to give you 2 examples. The first one is that after the IPCC 1.5 degrees report in autumn 2018, 8 political parties that are represented in the Parliament adopted a common climate position paper where they supported tightening the climate policy on both national and EU level. And after the next election in summer 2019, the new and current government adopted a climate neutrality goal for 2035 as the national target. And as the 8 parties had agreed, the Finnish government also decided that Finland's goal in EU is that EU sets a climate neutrality target for 2050 and also strengthens the target for 2030 accordingly. And the latest half of 2019 was the time when Finland had the EU presidency. And during that time, also the Finnish Parliament organized a conference on climate change between EU member state parliaments. And this meeting adopted presidency conclusions by a majority, emphasizing the urgency of climate measures, meeting the Paris Agreement targets, and supported strengthening the EU climate targets. Later in the autumn, the same line was reflected in the more formal meeting, so-called COSAC meeting, which is a meeting of EU committees of the EU member country parliaments. And as many of you might know, later in that autumn, the Finnish, not Finnish, but European heads of governments adopted as EU target carbon neutrality by 2050. And this started the more detailed work on strengthening the EU climate legislation. And quite recently, the European Parliament, the European Council, and the Commission reached a negotiation deal on the European climate law, which tightens the EU climate target for 2030 to minus 55%, which is 15% units tighter than the previous EU target for 2030. Well, my second example is the Finnish Climate Act, and may I have the next slide. The Finnish Climate Act became effective in 2015, and this initiative came from the political parties which formed the government after the 2011 elections. So the act came into force in summer 2015, a couple of months before the Paris conference, which then agreed the Paris Agreement. And since then, Finland has already tightened our national target. So the current law says that our emission target for 2050 is minus 80%, but because we now have a more ambitious target of being carbon neutral by 2035, this 2050 target is going to be tightened, and also intermediate targets for 2030 and 2040 are going to be adopted. And the current plan is that the updated law will come from the government to the parliament during this year. And the climate law, basically it guides policy planning, for example, transport policy planning, but it also emphasizes participation, transparency, and predictability. And one aspect of that law is that the government is obliged to give a climate report every year to the parliament. And originally, the idea of this climate report was to be mainly just statistical reporting. But our Environment Committee has demanded and obliged the government to develop this annual climate report in such a way that it provides a clear overview of emission trends and the adequacy of the climate measures, and in an easy to read format, a way to assess if there is a gap between the adopted measures and the targets, and so that we politicians can take decisions on well-informed basis. And may I have the last slide? Important aspect of the climate law is that the policy must be science-based. The law established a scientific climate change panel, which is an independent scientific advisory board to assist the government in designing national climate policy. This national climate panel has been really important in strengthening the scientific basis of political discussion and decision making, and improving the quality of discussion on climate issues. And for example, at the moment, a topical issue is how to design the COVID-19 recovery measures in an optimal way, so that it helps us also to speed up our shift towards a carbon neutral circular economy. But of course, I think all of us know climate change is just one aspect of a broader sustainability crisis, and loss of biodiversity is another aspect of this. And therefore, also 2015, a National Scientific Biodiversity Panel was established. And this panel functions also as the Finnish panel for IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So this was my effort to, in a nutshell, describe how the system functions and what we have done in the Finnish Parliament to strengthen both national and EU level climate policy, and via EU also influence the international policy. And I think that it's very important for all parliamentarians to be aware that it's real and meaningful to take action on national level to make stronger national legislation, but it matters also for international level, because all positive changes on national policy, they have an influence also on the international level. And I just would like to wish all the best to all parliamentarians working to prevent a catastrophic climate change, which is the biggest threat to the future of our societies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Satu. I will move immediately to the next speaker. It's Georgios Amanetidis, Parliamentary Research Administrator at the Policy Department for Economic, Scientific and Quality of Life Policy at the European Parliament. Georgios, please.
Thank you, Elena. Good afternoon to all of you. I would like to thank the organizers for giving the opportunity to present EU climate change policies from an EP, a European Parliament perspective. Permit me to express also that I'm particularly pleased to speak after Satu Hassi, who was the protagonist of some of these climate actions that were carried out in the European Parliament during the last decade, during the time that she was serving as a parliamentarian. I'm working in the policy department. Next slide, please. Policy department is one of the two units that are supporting the Environment Committee of the European Parliament. The committee secretariat helps directly on the work of the committee, the procedures, the votes. The policy department provides support, studies, seminars, briefings to help the committee to carry out its tasks. Next, please. Katja spoke a little bit about the EU and the particularities of climate. This helps me also to go directly to say that the EU is competent to act by the principle of subsidiarity. So it is considered that for issues like climate change, it's better to act in a pan-European level in comparison to local or national level. The EU has been the pioneer and the role model for countries across the world, helped enormously to reach agreement in Paris in 2015. I would like to stress that it was the EU Environment Council already in 1996 that set the target of 2 degrees Celsius to limit the global average temperature, a target that became later on in Copenhagen in 2009 and certainly in Paris in 2015 a global target. And also that the EU share of global emissions fell from about 20% in 1990 to less than 9% in 2019. Next, please. But which is the European Parliament role since parliamentary conference? The European Parliament is a co-legislator in many issues, including climate change. Permit me to recall that it's the European Commission that makes the proposals, and it's up to European Parliament together with the European Council, the member states, to reach an agreement on these proposals in order to become European law. In the European Parliament, fighting climate change is a priority, and the Parliament also gave its consent to, in order to ratify the Paris Agreement, that the EU ratifies the Paris Agreement. The European Parliament is negotiating with the Council from position that traditionally add ambition to the measures against climate change. The European Parliament takes part in all UNFCCC conference in COPs already since 1997, when the Kyoto was agreed in COP3. It's an observer, but is part of the European delegation. The Parliament gives increasing emphasis on implementation of policies in the member states and on what was left out from the Paris Agreement. And this is, as an example, the aviation emissions, the maritime emissions. And also the Parliament declared climate emergency in November 2019. Next, please. This is, in a nutshell, a little bit the three different packages of climate and energy actions. In 2008, the first climate and energy package was agreed, and by that time, it was foreseen it aimed to reach minus 20% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, 20% share of renewable energy, and 20% energy efficiency. This was known as 20-20-20. Prior to Paris, Europe increased these targets, and this became 40, 32, and 32.5, with a target year 2030. And we are now in a, let's say, in a third round of actions with the European Green Deal, which aims to goes to minus 55% for greenhouse gas emissions, including natural removals, while we expect in July 2021, next July, that proposals for renewable energy and energy efficiency by the Commission. Next, please. I will give you an example about the role of the Parliament, and the case is the first package of the climate energy package. It was in view of the Paris, the European Council, following a Commission proposal, proposed these three main targets that I mentioned before: 40% for greenhouse gas emissions, 27% for renewables, and 27% for energy efficiency. The European Parliament, once these proposals, the Commission proposals, were sent to the Parliament, the plenary, the negotiation mandate increased these targets, at least as a position of the Parliament, to 40, 35, and 40 respectively. Following 2 years of extensive negotiations between the Council, an agreement was reached in 2018, and these were the current targets for the European Union: 40%, 32% for the share of renewables, and 32.5% improving energy efficiency. Next slide, please. You have seen before this slide. The point that I would like briefly here is that the European Green Deal aimed to reach climate neutrality by 2050 all over Europe. The point that I would like to make is that it's not a simple climate package or a climate and energy package. It covers all different sectors: clean energy, circular economy, buildings renovation, zero pollution, preserving the ecosystems, and biodiversity, the flagship activity, farm to fork, on food policies, and of course, transport, how to make transport sustainable and smart. Next, please. The second example is about the role of the Parliament, is that about the European Green Deal emission reduction target. In 2018, in October 2018, at the moment that everything was agreed, that the 40 to 32 and 32.5 was agreed, the European Parliament, in define its position and in view of the COP24 in Katowice, and requested the increase of the EU target to become 55%. 1 year later, the new Commission President promised the Parliament that she will work to bring this target to at least 50% and make it towards 55%. However, 1 year later, September last year, finally the Commission proposed following an impact assessment to make the European target to bring it to 55%, as the Parliament requested already in October 2018. However, the Parliament returned again with a more ambitious target. In October, 1 month later, the Commission proposal requested the emission reduction target to be to 60%. As part of the European climate law, there were 6 trialogue negotiations between the Commission, the Council, and the Parliament, and the Parliament was not successful. The EU target remained 55%, but there is a series of other measures that, as part of this negotiation, the Parliament succeeded to bring in order to make this target to be reached in an easier and more safe way. Next slide, please. You may see here in one graph all these targets, how they evolved starting from 1990. You may see that in this blue solid line, the real EU emissions, and Europe not only set targets, but succeeds to bring the targets, to make the target a reality. In 2019, the EU emissions were already 24%, surpassing the original target of 20%. And if you follow the dots, the orange dots, you see how Europe would like to become carbon neutral, take into account also the natural removals, but also technological removals that will be progressively evolve. Next slide, please. This is my last slide. I would like to say that apart from regulating for others, the European Parliament is trying also to clean its own house, its own greenhouse gas emissions. Since 2016, the European Parliament claims that it's the first European institution to become carbon neutral, but this is based on offsetting 100% of its irreducible emissions. As this offsetting, it was really a Kyoto Protocol way of addressing issues by offsetting emissions in developing countries. The European Parliament and the Commission would like to become carbon neutral by 2030, but this time with domestic measures. The European Parliament decreased its emissions from 2006 to 2018 by 37.7% per person, but only 15% in absolute terms. So as a policy department, we were requested to examine how the European Parliament can become carbon neutral by 2030. And in a study, we described mitigation measures to reduce drastically the European Parliament greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. These are some links. You can see what I have mentioned, the involvement of the legislative actions, the carbon footprint study, the MORIFO on the Green Deal. And this is the end. I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Georgios, for sharing with us these very optimistic facts, and also for your time. I know that you have to leave soon, so I will understand if you will not stay for the Q&A part. I just wanted
partly.
Okay, great. I just wanted to note that Professor Biedenkopf already was so kind that she answered a few questions in the Q&A box. So if any of you would like to check them, you can find them in the answer tab. And there is one question we received for Satu Hassi. about Finnish example. So, Satu, what mechanisms are available for citizens and communities' involvement in the policy planning?
One quite successful method which we in Finland have had already for many years is carbon neutral municipalities network. So I don't remember by heart how many municipalities there are that have established local carbon neutrality targets. But also the biggest cities like Helsinki, Tampere and Turku have established local carbon neutrality targets. Unfortunately, I don't remember by heart the target years, but there has been a sort of competition between the biggest cities on how to make the cities carbon neutral, and that has been linked to real action. For example, Helsinki is phasing out coal in the district heating production, and the same with Turku. And also Tampere is shifting towards carbon neutral district heat production. And district heat is very important in Finland because most houses in Finnish cities are connected to a district heating network. But also, of course, transport decisions like promoting public transport and biking have been important parts of these carbon neutrality policies, which are quite topical now that we will have our next municipal elections in a couple of weeks.
Thank you so much. These are very inspiring examples. So I would like to move to the next session. Thank you so much, Katja, Satu, and Georgios for your excellent presentations. So we're moving now to the second session of the day on regional and global parliamentary action. And I would like to introduce you Emily Lemieux, Deputy Director at Open Parliament and Sustainable Development at Parliamericas, who will be also leading and moderating this session, which gives me a few minutes of break. Thank you so much, Emily.
Thanks so much, Elena. As you mentioned, I'm here in representation of Parliamericas. And for those who are less familiar, we are the institution that promotes parliamentary diplomacy in the Inter-American system, regrouping all 35 parliaments of the Americas and the Caribbean. Our work focuses on 3 thematic areas: gender equality, open parliaments, and climate change and sustainable development, which is what brings us here today. So I'm very grateful to Interpares for the invitation to moderate this panel. And I'd like to start by thanking our panelists and welcoming them. We have with us Paula Vega, member of the Legislative Assembly of Costa Rica. She is the Vice President of the Parliamericas Parliamentary Network on Climate Change for Central America. We have Marini Mera, CEO of the Global Legislators Organization for a Balanced Environment, and Michael Skoulos, the Secretary General of the Circle of Mediterranean Parliamentarians for Sustainable Development. So thank you all for being here today and for participating in this panel. And so in this session, we want to address the importance of parliamentary diplomacy and regional and global parliamentary networks to advance climate action. And to start off our discussion, I'd like to briefly share a few reflections from our experience at Parliamericas as to why we created this parliamentary network on climate change and what we found to be helpful to support our member parliaments in advancing this agenda. The prior conference panel addressed very well the important role that parliaments play in this sphere, and we're all aware of the importance of international collaboration to address the most pressing challenge of our lifetimes. But that collaboration generally takes place through the executive branch with reason. And in most cases, there are very limited mechanisms to transfer this knowledge and this information to the parliament in order for them to undertake their critical roles of oversight, budget approval, and legislation. And so in our hemisphere, we really saw a gap in access to easily digestible information for parliamentarians in their country's official language on climate policy, on the international frameworks and supporting tools or mechanisms that have been negotiated to advance this work, and on the national commitments that are made within these frameworks. So having access to that information and to a space to debate and share good practices for parliamentary work to advance these commitments is critical to support parliamentary work on a national level. And in addition to sharing this information, this network allows us to bring together legislators from all backgrounds and political stripes to have these conversations and to build consensus on strategies to move forward, which can be easier to do in an international setting where partisanship is less prominent. And as representatives of the people, parliamentarians' views represent the different segments of society, and it's important for all those concerns to be heard and considered as legislative proposals are debated and as government policies are overseen. But building a consensus across the political spectrum to have this common understanding that this issue is a priority, it requires urgent and sustained action that's critical to the success of these efforts. Some members might be in the opposition today with an important oversight role, and tomorrow they could be the government. And either way, they play a really large role in shaping the national discourse, which impacts political decisions. And we need that continued commitment at all levels to support this work, because as a planet, we can't afford to take 5 steps back and start over when there are changes in governments. And this also contributes to parliamentarians' abilities to also fulfill their role in ensuring public access to information and transparency around climate data, to hold the government accountable to achieve the results that they've committed to, as noted by our keynote this morning. The network also provides a space for collaboration with partner organizations, including UN agencies, to integrate parliamentarians in these important international conversations so that their voices are heard as commitments are being developed, and then they're better placed to follow up on their government's commitment nationally. And we've also noted the importance of having flexible programming as part of this network. Given the nature of Parliament's work, we've seen many benefits to adapting quickly to the needs of our members, particularly since the start of the pandemic. We've produced resources like our guide to support a green economic recovery post-COVID-19 with tailored guidance for parliamentarians. We've hosted peer exchanges to talk about building forward better and not losing sight of climate action as we're addressing the immediate social and economic impacts that are caused by the pandemic. And we've also addressed some national issues that might come up as priorities for parliaments in the region, like, for example, the conservation of marine biodiversity for coastal countries in the South Pacific Ocean. And to translate all of these good practices that are shared in international spaces to some of our member parliaments, they have found it helpful to organize technical support and tailor national workshops to engage a broader range of parliamentarians and parliamentary staff to address a specific local objective or to build momentum to achieve that. Most recently, these workshops that we've held have focused on strategies to coordinate parliamentary action to support the implementation of the SDGs through the establishment of a parliamentary group, studies to develop an agenda of legislative reforms, or the adoption of tools that are used by all legislators and staff to bring sustainable development lens to all the bills that are being debated in Parliament. This was the case in Panama, for example, which I believe you'll have the opportunity to hear about in a later session today. And finally, just to wrap up this brief introduction on a bit of a smaller institutional scale as well, we recognize the importance of parliamentarians leading by example and taking steps to ensure that the operations of their institution are green as possible. And for that reason, we created a guide on reducing environmental footprint for parliaments. And as the Secretariat, we've joined the UNFCCC Climate Neutral Now initiative and encourage member parliaments to do so as well. And so now I'd like to turn to our panelists. And to talk to us about the thematic issues that are being addressed by the America's Parliamentary Network on Climate Change, I'd like to invite Paula Vega, member of the Legislative Assembly of Costa Rica, to start us off with our panel discussion.
Thank you, Emily. Buenos días a todas y a todos. Voy a hablar en español para que puedan cambiar la interpretación si fuera necesario. Me alegra mucho ver tantas personas interesadas en este tema, muchísimo más en época de pandemia. Creo que el gran reto que tenemos hoy día es que cuando pensábamos que comenzábamos a tener efecto en sensibilizar a la población y a las autoridades políticas sobre el tema climático, de repente vino una pandemia que nos cambió todas las reglas de juego. Y por supuesto que a la luz de la crisis sanitaria y la crisis económica que esta pandemia ha ocasionado a nivel mundial, ha sido difícil mantener el tema del cambio climático en la palestra, en el debate. Sin embargo, tenemos que ser muy insistentes en el tema de que mientras la pandemia avanza, el cambio climático sigue ahí. El cambio climático no se detiene por la pandemia, el cambio climático no espera por la pandemia y los efectos más bien ahora pueden ser doblemente catastróficos. No sé en los países de ustedes, pero por lo menos acá en la región latinoamericana se ha dado un fenómeno o dos fenómenos al mismo tiempo. Por un lado, la pandemia ha servido para el ascenso de un discurso negacionista, de un discurso de algunos grupos fundamentalistas que han ido teniendo, que han ido adquiriendo fuerza a nivel de los países y han aprovechado para introducir un falso antagonismo entre desarrollo económico y medio ambiente. Nos han devuelto de repente décadas a la discusión anacrónica de la explotación racional de los recursos, de que no es posible levantar la economía pensando en el ambiente, y este es quizás el reto más peligroso que tenemos como parlamentarios, lograr descolocar ese discurso. En Costa Rica, que es un país verde reconocido a nivel mundial por sus políticas ambientales, tenemos hoy día diputados pidiendo que abramos la explotación de petróleo. Tenemos hoy día diputados a contracorriente de todas las tendencias mundiales en materia climática y queriendo cada vez debilitar más los presupuestos en materia ambiental y en materia climática. Es importante aumentar las voces, es importante este tipo de redes que nos permiten intercambiar conocimiento y experiencia, y es importante capacitar y sensibilizar a todas aquellas fuerzas políticas que no necesariamente tienen este tema como uno de sus prioritarios. Ante ello, creo que tenemos también algunos retos tácticos y estratégicos. No estamos en la misma sintonía que estábamos hace 2 años. Hoy por hoy, por supuesto que va a costar, que va a ser difícil hablarle a la gente de cambio climático cuando están resolviendo los temas inmediatos de hambre y pobreza. Pero entonces ahí tenemos un reto o dos retos. Uno, ser muy proactivos en elaborar diversos discursos sobre el cambio climático para convencer a socios estratégicos, sociedad civil y empresas. Hay que ligar el tema con lo económico. El tema del cambio climático tiene que ser rentable, tiene que generar desarrollo, tiene que generar empleos. Joe Biden anunciaba hace 2 semanas su plan de reactivación económica y prometía 19 millones de empleos verdes, siendo Estados Unidos un país que, por ejemplo, no cuenta con el nivel de oportunidades que cuentan países de América Latina en estos mercados de generación de empleos verdes. Entonces, de alguna manera, tenemos que buscar soluciones que no solamente ofrezcan mitigación, adaptación y acción climática, sino también desarrollo, empleo y beneficios económicos para el sector empresarial, de alguna manera, hacer un tipo de pacto en ese sentido. Y cambiar los lenguajes de forma tal que la madre soltera que vive en la costa y que está viendo en el día a día cómo darle de comer a sus hijos, pueda entender que el cambio climático la afecta directamente, entorpece a futuro sus fuentes de empleo, sus fuentes de sobrevivencia, y meterla en nuestra misma lucha. Ahí hay consignas importantísimas como el concepto de transición justa. Todos recordaremos el fallido esfuerzo de una política ambiciosa cuando no se piensa en equilibrar las desigualdades, como fueron los chalecos amarillos de Francia, las protestas con Macron. Y creo que ese es uno de los desafíos que tenemos por delante, lograr avanzar en materia climática sin dejar a nadie atrás y sin que el tema climático profundice las desigualdades. Para contarles un poco de qué venimos haciendo desde la Red Parlamentaria de Cambio Climático, y antes algo que quiero decir es que es importante desarrollar grupos de incidencia parlamentarios también para que tengamos como legisladores una mayor presencia en las COPs. Ustedes han visto que en las COPs el rol de los legisladores es realmente escaso, es realmente escueto, y finalmente son los legisladores los encargados, o somos los legisladores los encargados de readecuar todo el diseño institucional y normativo de forma tal que sea amigable con el tema climático. Entonces tenemos que lograr tener una mayor incidencia en las COPs. En la COP pasada comenzamos a tener un poco de incidencia mediante grupos como Parlaméricas, etcétera, pero hay que apuntar a más participación en la COP, muchísimo más con las épocas que vienen. La Red Parlamentaria de Cambio Climático, de la cual tengo el honor de ser vicepresidenta por Centroamérica, una región altamente vulnerable al cambio climático, como sabrán, opera desde el año 2016 y lo que genera es redes, estrategias y alianzas entre parlamentarios para poder atender y diseñar conjuntamente estrategias en materia climática, sinergias en este sentido. Y para contarles un poco, hemos tenido algunos énfasis. Hay un énfasis muy importante que tiene que ver con el tema de reducción de riesgos y de los desastres, un tema que para América Latina es de sobrevivencia pura y que ha sido un tema precisamente de conflicto en las COPs. A la hora de hablar de quién aporta la cooperación y quién paga las pérdidas y los daños por desastres naturales, los países emisores siguen esquivando la discusión, mientras que países que están pidiendo auxilio, algunos más que otros, como el Foro de los Países Vulnerables, etcétera, los países caribeños, siguen clamando por una solución. Les cuento el caso de Costa Rica. Hoy Costa Rica está sumida en una crisis económica muy difícil. Justamente habíamos aprobado una reforma fiscal que nos iba a permitir respirar un poco a nivel económico, y en ese momento vino la pandemia. Entonces todos los esfuerzos que se hicieron con la reforma tributaria han quedado en pausa y hoy por hoy tenemos un déficit fiscal que alcanza casi el 7% del Producto Interno Bruto. Se están haciendo medidas para atender este déficit fiscal, pero ¿qué pasa? Y vean la ironía. Nos han advertido que de no hacer nada con el tema de atención de desastres, el gasto por eventos climáticos como sequías, los eventos por lluvias intensas, etcétera, va a llegar a ser de un 8% del Producto Interno Bruto. Entonces, miren la ironía, de nada serviría que Costa Rica tome todos los esfuerzos para sanear las finanzas públicas si no contempla el tema climático, porque resulta que el porcentaje de Producto Interno Bruto que invertiremos en atención de desastres es muchísimo mayor al déficit fiscal actual. Entonces, en ese sentido, y muy en la línea de operativizar el marco de Sendai, Parlaméricas ha trabajado foros entre pares, ha diseñado un protocolo marco para que los parlamentarios de nuestra red puedan seguir, y viene un poco en la generación de buenas prácticas regionales y nacionales para la atención de reducción de riesgos y de desastres. Ahora estamos haciendo un énfasis especial con los países caribeños que lamentablemente están viviendo las secuelas de una manera muy cruda. Un tema al que hemos apuntado también es la economía circular. Les hablaba ahora de que de nada serviría tener las mejores técnicas de adaptación climática si no cambiamos el modelo que genera emisiones desde el núcleo. Y en este tema, las prácticas de consumo y producción sostenibles son vitales. Parlaméricas ha comenzado a enfocarse en economía circular. Tenemos que cambiar de una vez por todas este modelo de economía lineal e integrar el ciclo de los productos de una manera sostenible, que además es una oportunidad de generar empleo. Todo esto que estamos desaprovechando en la cadena de valor puede generar empleo a poblaciones vulnerables como mujeres, madres solteras, por ejemplo, mujeres de comunidades rurales y demás. Ahí hemos sacado una declaración conjunta muy potente y muy fuerte de todos los parlamentarios, y estamos haciendo esfuerzos para generar un tipo de alianza con la coalición de economía circular para América Latina y el Caribe. Otro tema es la transición justa, que les hablaba ahora con el ejemplo de los chalecos amarillos. Si algo tiene que lograr este cambio y esta acción climática, no concentrar más desigualdades sociales, y es por eso que Parlamérica dedicará su próxima reunión anual al tema de la transición justa, un tema que tiene que empezar a hablarse no solamente a nivel nacional, quiénes son los perdedores y los ganadores de una acción climática ambiciosa, sino a nivel mundial también. Ahí, por supuesto, que además entran temas que quedaron pendientes de resolver a nivel mundial, como mercados de carbono y otros. Trabajamos, por supuesto, con el seguimiento del Acuerdo de París. El Acuerdo de París, ahora que Estados Unidos volvió a entrar, es importante darle vitalidad, mantenerlo y ser cada vez más ambiciosos. En ese sentido, Parlaméricas presta apoyo para la revisión constante de las contribuciones nacionales y para ir haciendo la medición de cómo va avanzando cada país con los acuerdos de París y cómo como legisladores podemos aportar en ese sentido. En Costa Rica, por ejemplo, estamos dando varias discusiones que tienen que ver con alcanzar las metas del Acuerdo de París. Lamentablemente, la pandemia ha colocado muchísimas resistencias y ha acentuado la encrucijada de que no podemos generar acciones para salir de la pandemia, acciones post-pandémicas pensando en el tema climático. Nos toca desmentir eso, nos toca decir que la recuperación económica tiene que ser verde, tiene que ser climáticamente sostenible y más bien tomar todo esto que es este tema de que la pandemia nos ha puesto de cabeza y nos ha removido todas las estructuras, más bien tomarlo como una oportunidad para comenzar a hacer las cosas distinto y para comenzar a incorporar temas novedosos que no estábamos incorporando. Este es un poco el trabajo que hace la Red Parlamentaria de Cambio Climático de Parlaméricas. Tenemos vicepresidencias regionales, yo por Centroamérica y otras compañeras por la parte del sur y el norte, y lo que intentamos es justamente, dentro de las diferencias que puedan haber a nivel de países y regiones, tratar de homologar en la medida de lo posible la acción climática, compartir experiencia, compartir conocimiento y por supuesto que quedamos a las totales órdenes para cualquier tipo de cooperación que podamos tener en ese sentido. Gracias y bonito día.
Muchas gracias, diputada Vega, por compartir estas reflexiones sobre las prioridades de la red y los desafíos actuales que enfrentamos. Nos consideramos muy afortunados de contar con su liderazgo en la red. And so to continue our conversation, we'll now move to a perspective from a global network now with Marini Mera. And so we would love to hear from you on some of the initiatives that GLOBE is undertaking to foster parliamentary action on environmental issues.
Thank you very much, Emily, and good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whichever part of the world you're joining us from. Thank you very much to Inter Pares for inviting GLOBE to offer the perspectives from our members and our experience. It's been really interesting listening to the conversation today, starting with the keynote by the Honorable Sabir Chaudhry, who used to be the president of GLOBE in Bangladesh some time back and continues to be a forceful voice for parliamentary engagement and leadership. I think I will limit myself to a few examples of what GLOBE has been doing over the years. For those who are not familiar with GLOBE, we are an international network of champion parliamentarians who are committed to leadership on sustainable development and climate action. We were founded almost 30 years ago now by the likes of then Senators Al Gore and John Kerry and their counterparts in the European Parliament, in the Russian Duma, in the Japanese Diet and other parts of the world. Over that time, many of our members, together with the members of other parliamentary networks, have effectively created an international architecture of legislation on climate change. I've been active on these issues since the Kyoto conference. I think it was COP3 that was referenced in 1997. And at that time, globally, we had something like 50 to 55 pieces of legislation and policies that could be considered climate legislation. Over the course of those decades, we now have internationally in excess of 4,000 pieces of legislation, policies and measures related to climate change. So this is fundamentally a different world that we're operating in. And we heard from Satu Hassi earlier about the importance of parliamentary committees and legislation which is predicated on legally mandated targets, and the role of advisory bodies and committees, in particular scientific advisory bodies that hold governments to account. And of course, we've heard about the role of Parliament in demanding accountability through constitutional measures. The UK is one example there, with the UK's, there was the first country to have a Climate Change Act in 2008, which has effectively provided the gold standard and a model for climate change acts across the world. But one of the unique things about the UK's Climate Change Act is that it establishes an independent scientific committee to ensure that the government holds to its part of the bargain, in particular with regard to the carbon budgets, which are renewed on a 5-yearly basis. Within our own network, we have in recent years, of course, we've been extremely active at the COP summits, and traditionally Globe organizes the COP legislative summits. So at the last big COP in 2015 at Paris, we organized our largest ever assembly of parliamentarians, not just from our own network, but working very closely with the other parliamentary networks, climate parliaments, the IPU, the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, etc. And similarly, we will be holding the COP26 Legislators Forum, this time at the Scottish Parliament, not in Westminster, because the event is of course being held in Glasgow in Scotland. And we welcome our colleagues from all of the parliamentary networks to participate in the COP26 Legislators Summit. In terms of the particular actions that we're taking place towards that, I want to recognize the efforts of our members in Sub-Saharan Africa in particular, in Nigeria, in Senegal, and in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which under very different political circumstances have been trying to link up the issues of climate change and biodiversity loss and desertification. Of course, this year we're seeing the COP26 climate summit, but we also have the other two Rio conventions which are holding their COPs. And this is a point which is all too often missed, but it's extremely important. We have 3 Rio conventions, which came about in 1992. Most people are familiar with, of course, the UNFCCC, the Climate Convention, but fewer still are familiar with the Convention on Biodiversity, and fewer still with a Convention on Desertification. Both the Biodiversity Convention, the CBD Convention in Kunming, and the Desertification Convention towards the end of this year are taking place this year. So we are encouraging all of our members to look at these events as interconnected, effectively, essentially integral ones, where the Rio Convention commitments have to be looked at and attended to by governments, by parliaments, together, collectively, not in this piecemeal manner in which climate is considered by some, biodiversity by others, and desertification yet by other parties. So a coherent approach is essential. In 2015 at the Paris Summit, we promoted our approach to look at all of these international multilateral commitments in a convergent and coherent way. So we promote a policy of coherence and convergence by parliaments, by governments, in addressing these international commitments. And the speaker before me, Paulo Vega, spoke very passionately about the importance of ensuring that we attend to disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management. Now, of course, those of you who remember the sequence of summits in 2015 will remember that that big event, that big year, started off with the Sendai Summit, which was about the adoption of a new international framework on disaster risk reduction. And it ended with COP15, with COP21 in Paris. Now, why I mention that is because in many of our members' countries, for example, in the Philippines, the issues of climate change and disaster risk reduction are looked at jointly. In Philippines, for example, there is a joint committee on climate change and disaster risk management. So that's a really good example about how these issues, which are too often seen in separate silos, are brought together. At Globe, we actively encourage the adoption and the implementation nationally of the Sustainable Development Goals. So with the Sustainable Development Goals, with the Sendai Framework, with the Paris Commitment, and with this year, of course, the focus on biodiversity and desertification, it's a very full agenda for parliaments. And the challenge in parliaments is of ensuring that the parliamentary structures themselves promote a coherent approach. As most of you will be familiar, there is this disciplinary segregation in both the executive as well as in the legislative context. So I want to give an example of one positive innovation which has taken place. In the UK Parliament, there has, in the course of the last couple of months, been a new scrutiny effort looking at the preparation for COP26 by the UK presidency. This process brings together 7 leading committees, and they range from international development to the Treasury Committee, to the committees for the devolved regions, and of course the environment committees. And collectively, these committees have formed a super committee scrutinizing the government's preparations towards the Glasgow summit. So it's an example of an innovation at the parliamentary level, and it's accompanied by innovation at the civil society level also, because accompanying this process is a coordination group of the various different committees within parliaments, as well as international and national networks, parliamentary networks such as Globe, where we coordinate our efforts to ensure that parliamentarians have a platform for engagement with the official process, the negotiation process leading up to COP, but also engaging with the wider public. Let me end by mentioning one of the things that we're doing, which we think is a real model for citizens' engagement in particular. Over the course of the last few years, we have been very inspired by the rise of the youth movement and youth activism on climate change. And most of you will remember that if we just look at Greta Thunberg's example, she started her campaign outside the Swedish parliament with a call for parliaments to declare emergency. Now, many parliaments have declared emergencies across the world. And in fact, the Fridays for the Future movement encourages young people to march their parliaments in their capital cities on Fridays. Now, in the UK context, that's an interesting concept because on Fridays, parliamentarians are not in the national parliament, they are in their local constituencies, because we have a tradition of parliamentarians being in their constituencies for what is called their Friday surgery. So Globe a couple of years ago started to hold these to encourage parliamentarians, beginning with London, to hold surgeries on Fridays with the young people. We call these the student MP climate surgeries. And we do it for 2 reasons. The first is to promote the political education and the citizenship development of young people, to encourage them to understand how their constitution works and the role of their members of parliament in the climate emergency. With regard to the parliamentarians, we do it to encourage them to look at local constituency action and to understand better what the local climate risks and vulnerabilities are. And this year will be a major focal point for us, because this will be held during London Climate Action Week, in which we seek to engage all of London's members of parliament. There are 73 members of parliament, and in fact, 1 in 9 of all UK parliamentarians is a London MP. We will be doing the same kind of model for all of Scotland, just ahead of COP26, with a view to having each of those constituencies with their young people issuing pledges. So we hope that this provides an example for what legislators can do across the world in other geographies to ensure that that engagement between parliamentarians and their constituencies and their young people is effective and it's long lasting. So let me stop there for now, and I'd be happy to pick up on any questions, but thank you for this opportunity to share those thoughts with you. Back to you, Emily. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mera. It's great to hear about Globe's work to promote parliamentary engagement on the UNFCCC, the conventions on biodiversity and desertification, and the coordination of all these interlinked issues, as well as these initiatives that you're talking about now with youth engagement. We will now turn to Michael Skoulas to learn from your experience with the Circle of Mediterranean Parliamentarians for Sustainable Development. Mr. Skoulas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Emily, and I'm really grateful to Interpares and very happy to see familiar faces and organizations that have contributed considerably in bringing parliaments and parliamentarians together. I have been serving for 25 years representing the European Parliament, the board of the European Environment Agency, and I was very happy to hear Satu Hassi and also Yorgos Amanatidis before, and also the extremely important work of Globe. I would like to present the Circle of Mediterranean Parliamentarians for Sustainable Development, which was established in 2022. And in fact, it is a circle of people who feel accountable, who would like to be agents of change, and they come from all Mediterranean, nearly all Mediterranean countries, north and south. We keep only the active parliamentarians in the circle, and all the others are supporting members, and the number is relatively small, but the impact, I think, is important. Out of the 4 members, for example, of COMSUD from Greece, the one is the Minister of Environment, it became, the second, the Deputy Minister, the third lady is the chairing the Environment Committee in the Parliament. And similar things happen in other countries. In fact, we've heard also from the analysis of Katja before that even within the EU, in the Southern Mediterranean, we have less awareness within not only the public, but also and mainly political leaderships. And we have to keep in mind that we have a north-south interface in the Mediterranean, which is not a UN region, is an eco-region. And there is a need for all sustainability issues, and particularly for climate change, in bringing the two coasts together and finding ways for advocacy, for support, and for common action. And particularly because the European Union is one of the leaders, and we need to actually harvest this experience and try to help the southern neighborhood a lot on that. I would like to say that this is the chairman now comes from Morocco, Professor Mohamed Resdali. And I would like to mention key areas and methods. Our resources are limited, and what we try to actually do is to use well-established, respected networks with whom we work, like the Mediterranean Information Office for Environment, Culture and Sustainable Development, which is the network federation bringing together practically all major NGOs and civil society organizations dealing with environment, sustainable development, culture in the area, or the Global Water Partnership, a network of another 100 organizations in the area, and other like the Arab Network for Environment Development and other groups who could have a continuous dialogue with parliamentarians of the different countries that have also a global and regional vision, particularly for issues now we are discussing, like the climate change, but also biodiversity and desertification, as it was mentioned before. And we focus also on the big role of education for sustainable development, formal, non-formal, informal, and awareness raising, again using a big network, the MEDIS, the Mediterranean Educational Initiative for Environment Sustainability, which has more than 6,000 educators and education organizations in the region. So it is an ongoing active collaboration. Within this collaboration, and what we believe a significant issue on climate change is going to be printed and also become available through internet in view of Glasgow, focusing on the different political issues about the Mediterranean, where all actors have a position there, explaining also the challenges and what we can expect as solutions. I would like to focus only on few things which are important for our region. The one is the Aarhus Convention, which is a UNECE convention. So it covers the north part of the Mediterranean. And we want to expand that through our very close collaboration with the two major political platforms for the Mediterranean, which is the Barcelona Convention for the protection of the Mediterranean and the Union for the Mediterranean, which is the Euro-Mediterranean partnership. With both these bodies, we work hand in hand very closely, and they have recognized this initiative as flagship initiative for the Mediterranean Commission of Sustainable Development under the Barcelona Convention and for the Union for the Mediterranean. And this is the Aarhus Convention, the environmental information, public participation, and access to justice. And we ask to be adopted by all parliaments and countries in the region. This is critical because it is one of the issues of the climate democracy. I mean, something that all previous speakers touched upon, they didn't mention like that, but it is for us very important. And it is part of the dialogue and the way in which different parties could be brought together, as it was also presented for Finland, for example. The second is what Malini mentioned a little bit before, is widening the policies for mitigation and adaptation of climate change to the other Rio Conventions, but also if by using what we call the water, energy, food ecosystem approach, because there is no way, particularly in the Mediterranean, where we have 80% of the water used by agriculture, where tourism, which is based on heavily on transport, is a very important source of income. It is extremely difficult to deal with climate change issues cut off from the very important, vital for the survival and for economy, other issues. So we need to approach this in a more comprehensive, integrated way, as we try to do. In a nutshell, these are some of the key areas where ComSud works at the moment, but many other areas are linked with climate change, as previous speakers said. The youth unemployment, the migration, which is a big issue in the region, the gender issue, which is again an issue in the region. There are many important horizontal issues that touch upon or cut across the climate priorities per se. And with our limited resources, we try to influence through our members, parliaments and governments in not in understanding so much, but in speeding up and in considering also some of the difficult issues that sometimes are put aside in favor of the lower hanging fruits. So thank you very much for this opportunity. And I hope that this excellent initiative will have a follow-up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Skoulos, for sharing these key initiatives that you're working on in the Mediterranean and the importance of these collaborations to support parliamentary climate action. We are running out of time for our session today, and so we have time just for one question. And so we received one question for Malini Mera. You mentioned the link about the Convention on Biodiversity and the Convention on Desertification with climate change and how MPs can see those as part of the same policy dimension. Amidst this, how do you connect all of these with the SDGs as well?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. And thank you also, Michael. I'll just take this opportunity for saying I agree completely with what you've just said. And I was just writing it in that in the chat. You know, the problem is that with climate, we focus so much on mitigation and we focus on carbon mitigation. And we forget that there is a whole other agenda, which is about adaptation and building resilience. So that brings in, of course, you know, the other pieces, and water is fundamental to all of that, especially in the region that you're speaking from. In terms of how parliamentarians can connect these different agendas, they're not so different. I mean, if you just take COVID as an example, you know, everybody refers to COVID as sadly the dress rehearsal for the disruption which will be caused, which is being caused by the climate crisis, the climate emergency elsewhere. And what we have seen is that COVID is a public health emergency, but it has its roots in the degradation of our, you know, of ecosystems. Where there has been an intrusion into our natural world, and the resulting zoonotic viruses and these pandemics are a direct result of the industrialization and the economic development policy. So that's one way of looking at it. More practically, if I think of the work that's being done in Senegal and in DRC by GLOBE members. So in Senegal, they are actively promoting the Great Green Wall in Africa, which is designed to address the deforestation and land degradation issues by building this 8,000 kilometer great natural wonder across the width of continental Africa. That links with the UNFCCC because it is part of the REDD+ agenda. REDD stands for reduced emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And it's a plus because this is part of one of the mechanisms under the UNFCCC to address deforestation, of course, which contributes to 11% of global emissions, which is greater than the entire transportation sector taken together. So preserving forests and putting financial value on forests is essential. That is one of the really practical ways in which the UNFCCC is made to connect with the provisions under the Biodiversity Convention, as well as under the Desertification Convention. So I hope that's part of an answer to the questioner.
Thank you so much. And so we're out of time. So that brings our session to a close. Thank you so much to all our panelists, Manini, Michael, and Diputada Vega. It was a pleasure to have that conversation with you. Thank you so much. And I will turn it back over to Elena.
Thank you so much, Emily, for moderating, to all our speakers. Now we'll have time for a very short break, just 5 minutes. And for those who are staying at their desks, we will be sharing a video we received from the Polish Parliament on an amazing initiative they have. And without further spoilers, enjoy the video and your break, and see you shortly.
Gdyby nie pszczoły, z naszych stołów zniknąłby co trzeci produkt spożywczy, w tym aż 90% owoców. Życie bez pszczół na naszej planecie z pewnością nie byłoby możliwe w obecnej formie. Pszczoły miodne, w odróżnieniu od wielu innych owadów zapylających, charakteryzują się wiernością kwiatową. To oznacza, że robotnica zapyla kwiaty tylko na jednym gatunku rośliny, aż do jej przekwitnięcia. W każdym ulu może być nawet 50 000 pszczół robotnic. Rodzina pszczela funkcjonuje jak jeden organizm. Pszczoły dzielą się zadaniami. Najmłodsze, czyli robotnice, czyszczą plastry i dbają o porządek. Najstarsze są zbieraczkami i przynoszą do gniazda pyłek kwiatowy i nektar, z którego powstanie miód. Głową pszczelej rodziny jest matka. Jest ona większa i cięższa od pszczoły robotnicy. Jej głównym zadaniem jest produkcja jaj, których może złożyć nawet 3000 w ciągu jednej doby. Członkami pszczelej rodziny są także trutnie. Trutni, czyli samców, jest w ulu nawet do kilku tysięcy. Nie wykonują one w gnieździe żadnych prac. W okresie wiosenno-letnim trutnie biorą udział w locie godowym. To wtedy zapładniają one matkę, po czym giną. Wartość pszczół wynikająca z zapylania wynosi ponad 150 miliardów euro rocznie. To w przybliżeniu tyle, ile wynosi roczny budżet Unii Europejskiej. W Polsce jest to 7,5 miliarda złotych. Największym zagrożeniem dla pszczół są stosowane przez ludzi środki ochrony roślin oraz choroby pszczół. Problem masowej zagłady rodzin pszczelich rozpoczął się w Stanach Zjednoczonych w 2006 roku. Zjawisko to obserwowane jest również w Europie. Tworzenie pasiek miejskich, gdzie środki ochrony roślin nie są stosowane, jest szansą na ratowanie pszczół. Aby zwrócić uwagę na problem ginięcia pszczół, stworzono pasiekę sejmową, gdzie mieszka 14 pszczelich rodzin.
Dear participants, I hope you had a nice break, even though it was short. Welcome back. I kindly remind you that we have interpretation today in English, French, Spanish, and if you have any technical problems, please don't hesitate to write us in chat. We'll be able to assist you immediately. And as another reminder, we do not want to spend any time for very detailed biographies of our speakers, but we would like to still acknowledge them, and the link to the bios of all our speakers for both days will be available shortly in chat and on the dedicated webpage of the conference. So the next session of today is on engaging citizens in decision-making on climate. And I am pleased to give the microphone to Dermot Turney, an expert advisory group member at the Irish Citizens Assembly 2016-2018, and associate professor at the Dublin City University. Dermot, please, the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much, Elena. Thank you to Interpares for the invitation to join you, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you are. I will share my screen with you so that you can see my slideshow. Hopefully you can see that. So as Elena said, I'm an associate professor at Dublin City University, and I was a member of the expert advisory group to Ireland's Citizens Assembly, which deliberated on the topic of climate change. And in my remarks, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Ireland's experience of deliberating on climate change using a citizens' assembly. But before getting on to that, I just want to set the scene. The idea of citizens' assemblies has been mentioned once or twice over the course of yesterday or today, but for those of you less familiar with the concept, I just want to give you some background. So a citizens' assembly is what scholars, what academics in this field sometimes called a deliberative mini-public. So what does that mean? There are basically two core elements of a deliberative mini-public. One, which you can see on the screen there, one is that, as the name suggests, it's deliberative. So the participants in a process like this don't just receive expert information on the topic under consideration. The deliberation part is really important. That is to say, the opportunity to yes, to receive expert information on the topic, but then to spend a good amount of time deliberating on that topic, discussing that topic with other participants in the process. So it's not just a learning experience, it's a deliberation experience, so that the decisions taken by the process are truly informed. And the second core design element of deliberative mini-publics is that they are representative. Now, in the context of the role of parliaments in climate action, I think it's important to flesh out what we mean by representative, because it's not representative in the same way that parliaments are representative. So when we talk about parliaments being representative of the wider public, we think of parliaments being accountable to the wider public. Citizens' assemblies, the participants in a citizens' assembly or a deliberative mini-public aren't accountable in that way, but they are representative in the sense that they, if you like, they look like the wider population. And that's achieved through a process, typically through a process called sortition, which is where it's a bit like a lottery. So you select randomly from the wider population, you select a small group of people from the wider population, but you try to ensure in as far as possible that they are representative in the sense of looking like the wider population in terms of important demographic characteristics. So that could be things like gender, ethnicity, geography, rural, urban, socioeconomic status, level of education, and so forth, so that this smaller group of people are in a meaningful way representative of the wider wider public. So those are the key design elements of deliberative mini-publics, which is a kind of a category of democratic innovation, and then a citizens' assembly is a particular type of that. It typically runs over several months and involves something like 100 to 150 participants. So that's just by way of background about what a citizens' assembly is. And when we look at the topic of climate change, the interesting thing, or one of the interesting things, is that there is growing international experience of using citizens' assemblies to deliberate on climate change. I put on this screen a range of examples, mostly from Europe, but not exclusively, of instances where citizens' assemblies or very similar processes have been run specifically on the topic of climate change. So we have Ireland, the UK, Scotland, France, Denmark, Finland, and the state of Washington in the US. Here in Europe, Germany, Austria, and Spain are either in the process of establishing or in the process of planning a citizens' assembly on the topic of climate change. So this mechanism of engaging the public is gaining increasing traction. So what happened in Ireland? Ireland ran a citizens' assembly that convened over the period 2016 to 2018, but this wasn't Ireland's first experience of a national citizens' assembly. It was actually preceded by two similar initiatives. One about a decade ago, which was run by academics and funded by philanthropy, and then called We the Citizens. Then in 2012 to 2014, there was an initiative called the Constitutional Convention. And so when Ireland started a citizens' assembly in 2016, there was already a track record of this kind of process being run on topics of public importance. The Citizens' Assembly that met from 2016 to 18 deliberated on 5 different topics. So it wasn't just focused on climate change, it was focused on 5 topics. One of the other topics, and this got some international attention, was the question of whether Ireland's constitutional ban on abortion should be removed from the constitution. And it made the recommendation, indeed, that constitutional ban should be removed, and then in turn that was put to a referendum of the whole population, and that was passed by a majority of 2 to 1. So abortion was one of the topics. Climate change was another of the 5 topics considered by this citizens' assembly. It was covered over a period of 2 weekends in autumn 2017. It consisted of 26 hours of listening, discussion, and importantly, as I said earlier on, deliberation. So you can see on the slide there a photo of what it looked like. The participants, and there were 99 participants plus a chair in this process. They were seated around these round tables, and they heard from experts on climate change, from scientific and other experts on climate change, and then they gathered in these groups, and they discussed what they had heard and came to considered views on how Ireland should respond to climate change. And at the end of the process, they voted on a series of 13 recommendations, some of which were quite radical steps on climate change. Interestingly, there was more than 80% support in favor of all 13 recommendations. But what happened afterwards? I'm going to very quickly walk you through the process, because particularly what an audience interested in the role of parliaments might be interested in is how this relates to the broader policy-making process. And one thing I forgot to say earlier was that Ireland's Citizens' Assembly was commissioned by the Parliament. It was set up by a resolution of Parliament. So Parliament was the initiator of this. And the Citizens' Assembly in turn reported back to Parliament. So its report was published in spring 2018. Parliament then established a special committee on climate action tasked with considering the recommendations from the Citizens' Assembly. Then the following spring, in March 2019, the Parliamentary Committee, that special Parliamentary Committee on Climate Action, itself published its own report where it set out the recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly and its considered views. And in very large part, the Parliamentary Committee endorsed and amplified the recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly. That Parliamentary Committee report then informed an all-of-government climate action plan that was published in June 2019. Then in January 2020, there was a general election. A new government was formed in June 2020. And at the center of the climate change commitments of the programme for government of the new coalition government was a commitment to revise Ireland's climate law. And this links back to the first panel yesterday, in yesterday's session, about the role of legislation. So one of the core recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly was that Ireland's approach to climate change should be strengthened by putting climate change at the heart of government policymaking. And right now, this evening, in fact, at 9:15 Dublin time, the Irish Parliament will be voting on the second stage of its consideration of that piece of legislation to strengthen Ireland's 2015 climate change law. And it's expected that the legislation will pass through all stages of the legislative process over the coming weeks. But the important point is that this bill, this piece of legislation that is being voted on this evening in the Irish Parliament, can be traced directly to the first recommendation of the Citizens' Assembly that had that made that recommendation 3.5 years previously. So just to conclude then with some reflections on the Irish experience, I've touched on some of the impactful, one in particular of the impactful recommendations. Another, incidentally, was that there was very strong support for increasing the carbon tax. So participants in the Citizens' Assembly said, we, members of the Irish public, are willing to pay a higher carbon tax, which was an interesting recommendation. They also said that there should be a tax on the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, which accounts for just over 1/3 of Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions. That's a particularly politically controversial topic in Ireland, and that was one recommendation that the Parliamentary Committee didn't endorse. So not all of the recommendations were implemented, but most of them were, and more broadly, the Citizens' Assembly catalyzed the public debate on climate change. And I think for our deliberations today, the key question really isn't just about running these Citizens' Assemblies as mechanisms for engaging the public, but we need to think carefully about how they are integrated into the parliamentary process, into the democratic decision-making process. And I think one of the other speakers is going to be reflecting on the French experience of doing that. So I'll leave it there, but I'm happy to answer any questions in the discussion afterwards. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Dermot, and thank you for keeping up with the time. And I also would like to remind all the panelists, please keep to 7-8 minutes for each presentation. Now, I am pleased to introduce you to Lise Deschâtel, advisor at Citizens Convention for Climate in France. Lise, the floor is yours.
Merci. Je vais donc vous faire ma présentation en français pour permettre une variation dans les présentations. Merci de votre invitation. Donc, je vais vous présenter la Convention citoyenne pour le climat qui s'est déroulée en France entre octobre 2019 et juin 2020. Mon nom est Lise Deschâtel et j'ai été conseillère auprès du comité de gouvernance qui a organisé la convention en France. Je voulais vous présenter tout d'abord des éléments de contexte qui ont conduit à l'organisation de cette convention qui s'est tenue alors que la France, d'une part, a pris du retard dans la mise en œuvre de son action climatique et l'atteinte des objectifs qu'elle s'est fixés. Dans un contexte de manifestations sociales importantes, qui n'a pas entendu parler des gilets jaunes en France et de la réaction sociale forte à l'augmentation de la taxe carbone, et également d'autre part, et comme ailleurs dans le monde, au mouvement de mobilisation de la jeunesse et d'autres générations en faveur du climat. Dans ce contexte, on va dire, de conscientisation environnementale forte, le président de la République, Emmanuel Macron, au terme du grand débat national, qui avait déjà été un exercice de délibération ou de participation assez inédit à l'échelle nationale, avec l'organisation de grands débats auxquels participaient des membres du gouvernement, des parlementaires et des élus locaux aux côtés de citoyens dits lambda. Donc le président de la République annonce cette convention le 25 avril en précisant qu'elle sera chargée de définir des mesures structurantes pour réduire les émissions de gaz à effet de serre de la France d'au moins 40% d'ici à 2030, dans un esprit de justice sociale. 150 membres doivent être désignés, comme Dahamed l'a précisé à l'instant, c'est selon la méthode de la sortition que cela se fait. On tire donc des citoyens au sort et on s'assure que le plénum des 150 membres soit le plus représentatif possible des équilibres démographiques, en termes de diplôme, en termes de genre, en termes d'origine, de région et de catégories socio-professionnelles pour représenter la population française. Le président s'engage également à soumettre sans filtre les propositions qui seront faites par la Convention au Parlement, au référendum pour un vote de l'ensemble de la population ou en application directe. Cette convention, dont le graphique résume les différentes étapes de travail, s'est réunie à cette occasion et également une fois en distanciel du fait de la pandémie de Covid. Les travaux ont en fait, comme vous le voyez, d'abord consisté dans une introduction aux enjeux climatiques par des membres scientifiques de la communauté scientifique comme du GIEC, mais également par des membres du gouvernement ou d'autorités publiques qui ont présenté les limites ou les blocages de l'action politique française. Ces membres ont ensuite travaillé dans le cadre de 5 groupes de travail thématiques et auditionné différents experts, ou qui étaient également des représentants d'intérêts spécifiques, des élus, comme des représentants de business, d'organisations non gouvernementales, etc. Les 5 groupes thématiques qui avaient été sélectionnés correspondaient aux principaux postes d'émission. Donc, comme je le disais,
we hear you very well.
Ok, sorry. Donc, ils correspondent aux postes des missions principales, qui sont en France les transports, l'agriculture, le logement. Et on avait également 2 groupes de travail qui travaillaient sur les questions de consommation et de production et de travail d'autre part. Les membres ont échangé, comme il a été rappelé précédemment, le principe de cette assemblée reposait sur la délibération et donc la possibilité en fait pour tous ces membres de participer, de contribuer aux discussions comme aux décisions. J'ai voulu ici illustrer par une photographie ce côté délibératif qui était organisé par des praticiens de la délibération, mais qui réunissait des personnes très variées qui, en France, ne se seraient pas forcément croisées. On avait un chirurgien qui venait de la Côte d'Azur, aux côtés d'un étudiant réunionnais, d'une concierge de Paris et d'une avocate expatriée en Allemagne. C'est cet aspect-là, en fait, qui était aussi, on va dire, un des traits d'intérêt qu'a généré et qu'a suscité la Convention. Intérêt qui a aussi été témoigné par, comme vous le voyez sur cette photographie, ce sont des membres du Parlement français, en compagnie du ministre de l'Économie et des Finances, M. Bruno Le Maire, qui sont venus assister dans une position d'écoute au débat. Et un parlementaire qui sortait de ces débats nous témoignait que si à l'Assemblée nationale, les débats avaient été aussi, on va dire, cordiaux et dans une dynamique d'écoute et de respect, la démocratie française s'en porterait mieux. La Convention a donc fini ses travaux en juin 2020, Et malgré, on va dire, un cadre de travail limité, 7 sessions et des conditions qui ont été parfois un peu turbulentes avec des grèves, la pandémie, une visite impromptue du président de la République, la Convention a réussi donc à remplir son mandat en adoptant 147 propositions législatives et réglementaires qui étaient liées aux thématiques et aux secteurs mentionnés plus tôt, mais qui étaient également liées à la gouvernance de l'action climat en France. Ils ont également proposé 2 propositions de référendum sur lesquelles ils souhaitaient que l'ensemble de la population puisse s'exprimer, une révision de la Constitution française et la reconnaissance juridique du crime d'écocide, sur lequel ils avaient beaucoup travaillé. Ce rapport a été accueilli par le grand public et par les médias comme un ovni politique. Mais il est important de souligner que nombreux ont été les personnes à reconnaître que le curseur était placé assez loin en termes d'ambition par ce rapport. Certains parlent même d'une nouvelle frontière de l'action climatique qui aurait été dessinée. Ce que l'on sait, c'est que suite à l'adoption de ce rapport, on a un sondage qui démontrait que 7 Français sur 10 avaient entendu parler de la Convention citoyenne, qui avait été très présente dans les débats, en particulier à la fin, et qu'une majorité considérait que la Convention était justement légitime pour faire des recommandations au nom de la population française. Depuis, par ailleurs, des études ont été menées, ainsi que des sondages qui montrent qu'il y a un soutien très important aux propositions qui ont été faites par la Convention dans la population française, sur l'ensemble des mesures, toutes sauf une qui avait trait à la limitation de la vitesse sur autoroute. À l'heure de faire le bilan de l'exercice, et il est sans doute encore très tôt pour le faire, puisque la loi qui traduit ces propositions est en cours de discussion au Parlement français, on peut souligner que du côté négatif ou du côté, parmi les précautions à prendre, on voit qu'il y a de nombreuses tensions sont apparues lorsqu'il s'est agi de traduire de façon normative les propositions dans la loi, dans des règlements ou dans le cadre d'un référendum qui est aujourd'hui bloqué par l'une des chambres du Parlement. On doit reconnaître également que pour l'instant, aucun sondage ne montre que la population a plus de confiance dans le système démocratique ou dans les décideurs publics à ce stade, et c'est sans doute plus qu'un exercice qui devra contribuer à réparer cette crise-là. Pour autant, on doit souligner en fait la résonance très importante et la capacité qu'a eu la Convention à amener des nouveaux débats ou à raviver des débats et à permettre une évolution des positions ou plus d'information de la population générale sur ces questions. Il est aussi important de noter qu'une étude récente qui a été conduite par Sciences Po en France, dans plusieurs États européens, montre que ces outils, les assemblées citoyennes, sont perçus comme des outils qui sont compatibles avec l'exercice de la démocratie représentative. Seulement 16% des Français estiment que les assemblées de citoyens ont peu d'intérêt et déprécient le travail des parlementaires. Et les chiffres dans d'autres pays comme en Allemagne ou au Royaume-Uni sont encore plus bas. 7% des Allemands estiment qu'il n'y a pas d'intérêt dans ces dispositifs. Donc ce qu'on peut dire, et pour conclure, pour ne pas dépasser mon temps, c'est que ces outils peuvent être des outils d'élaboration des politiques publiques utiles, de ce qu'on voit sur la base d'exemples que Darmed citait un peu plus tôt, mais également d'autres exemples qui n'avaient pas forcément trait au climat, mais à d'autres politiques, notamment je pense à tout ce qui s'est passé, tout ce qui a été travaillé en Belgique depuis plusieurs années. Toutefois, ces outils nécessitent certaines conditions, et on voit en France que c'est l'engagement politique et moral de l'autorité ordonnatrice et la façon dont l'articulation est pensée, organisée avec la représentation, avec la démocratie représentative, avec le Parlement, qui ont été des points de faiblesse ou des points qui auraient nécessité un travail différent. On doit aussi, et sans doute le dire, puisqu'il y a aujourd'hui en Europe un véritable attrait pour ces assemblées, rappeler qu'il n'y a pas déjà de modèle unique et il n'y a pas aussi de solution universelle qui résoudrait tous les problèmes. Elles font partie d'une boîte à outils beaucoup plus large, d'instruments délibératifs qui doivent être absolument débattus, explorés, notamment avec les décideurs publics et en particulier avec les parlementaires, puisque plutôt que de prendre ces outils comme des éléments concurrentiels, ils peuvent être complémentaires, ils peuvent enrichir et donner plus de substance à notre démocratie plutôt que l'appauvrir. Et je tiens simplement à finir en précisant qu'un réseau va être monté et mis en place avec notamment quelques participants de cette conférence à partir du mois de juin, qui doit permettre de réfléchir sur ces outils et qui se nommera le Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies et auquel les décideurs publics seront bien sûr conviés à participer. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Liz. Thank you very much. I will move directly to the next speaker, Javier Perez, Director of Political Watch and CEO of Parlamento 2030. Thank you, Javier.
Hello, buenas tardes. I will be speaking in Spanish this afternoon, so I give you a few seconds so if you want to switch languages. Bueno, muchas gracias por la invitación a Political Watch a participar en esta conferencia. En los minutos que tengo por delante, me gustaría hablarles de la relación de la ciudadanía con la actividad parlamentaria desde dos puntos de vista. En primer lugar, desde la elaboración de políticas públicas y, en segundo lugar, desde la labor de vigilancia de la ciudadanía de la labor de los parlamentos. Comencemos por la acción legislativa. En muchos de nuestros países, una vez que una iniciativa política cruza las puertas del Parlamento, se pierde toda posibilidad de que la ciudadanía pueda contribuir y pueda participar en la tramitación de estas iniciativas. Solo nos queda el lobby más tradicional, en el cual la ciudadanía tiene muchas menos posibilidades de influencia que el resto de stakeholders. Es verdad que muchos parlamentos cuentan con figuras como las peticiones o las iniciativas ciudadanas legislativas, pero seamos honestos, rara vez estas herramientas han funcionado satisfactoriamente y en la inmensa mayoría de los países siguen ancladas en el mismo diseño que hace décadas y no han aprovechado las inmensas posibilidades que la tecnología podría permitir para hacer que la participación sea más transparente, más fácil y más eficiente. Les cuento un ejemplo ilustrativo que ha ocurrido recientemente en España, el país del que procedo. El pasado verano se creó mucha expectativa por la creación de un primer canal de participación ciudadana en el Parlamento español para contribuir con ideas y sugerencias a los trabajos de una nueva comisión, la Comisión de Reconstrucción Social y Económica para políticas para salir de la crisis creada por la pandemia. Este canal de participación se acabó convirtiendo en un mero buzón de correo electrónico al que fueron llegando más de 1000 aportaciones ciudadanas que finalmente fueron publicadas por el Congreso español en un listado infinito de información sin clasificar y a los que no se dio ningún tipo de respuesta. No hubo ningún feedback simplemente porque nadie leyó estas aportaciones. Bajo nuestro punto de vista, este tipo de participación ciudadana solo crea frustración, desilusión y aumenta, si cabe más, la desafección que la ciudadanía siente respecto de los parlamentos. Voy a pasar ahora rápidamente a comentar las posibilidades que desde la ciudadanía existen para vigilar la acción parlamentaria y de exigir a sus representantes que rindan cuentas. Cuando una persona normal trata de conocer qué se está haciendo desde el Parlamento para responder a las problemáticas que le preocupan, por ejemplo, el cambio climático, se encuentra con una institución que no ha pensado en la ciudadanía a la hora de diseñar la forma en la que publica su información. ¿La información es pública? Sí, pero no suele ser accesible. Incluso para las organizaciones sociales más especializadas, la información sobre la actividad parlamentaria es un laberinto de términos confusos y de procedimientos poco intuitivos. Para tratar de solucionar este problema, cientos de organizaciones de monitoreo parlamentario a lo largo de todo el mundo, como Political Watch, la organización que dirijo, desarrollamos herramientas y sistemas para tratar de poner la información sobre lo que hacen los parlamentarios en manos de la ciudadanía. Permítanme que comparta pantalla un momento. Bien. En el año 2015 en España, y gracias a la colaboración del Ministerio de Asuntos Exteriores, Political Watch puso en marcha una innovadora herramienta llamada Parlamento 2030. Esta herramienta convierte la masiva publicación que realiza el Parlamento español en una base de datos estructurada y clasifica temáticamente su información gracias a una base de conocimiento que tiene más de 4.000 palabras clave relacionadas con las metas y los objetivos de la Agenda 2030. ¿Qué se consigue con esto? Bien, en primer lugar, ofrecemos una puerta de entrada fácil y accesible a la actividad parlamentaria, donde toda la información se ofrece de forma atractiva, en formatos reutilizables y listos para ser comprendidos y analizados por la ciudadanía. Les voy a mostrar a continuación una visualización de cómo funciona el acceso a la información. Aquí estaríamos eligiendo un ODS, por ejemplo, el ODS 13, y escogiendo una palabra clave, en este caso, movilidad eléctrica. Ya podríamos hacer una búsqueda. En este caso, nos muestra que hay 8 iniciativas parlamentarias relacionadas con la movilidad eléctrica. Si escogemos cualquiera de ellas, nos estaría mostrando la información básica de esta iniciativa y también, y lo que es más importante, su relación con todos los objetivos y metas de la Agenda 2030 que estén mencionados en el contenido de la iniciativa parlamentaria. En segundo lugar, una utilidad que también tiene esta herramienta es la llamada Escáner 2030, que permite el etiquetado en clave de Agenda 2030 de cualquier texto que quiera introducir la persona usuaria, sea un texto legislativo o de cualquier otra naturaleza. Algo que si lo realizáramos de forma manual nos llevaría horas de trabajo. Por ejemplo, ahora les voy a mostrar una visualización de qué se ve cuando introduces, por ejemplo, el texto de la nueva ley de cambio climático que está a punto de ser aprobada en España a través de este escáner 2030. Aquí están viendo el tipo de visualización que se genera con los vínculos del contenido de la ley con los diferentes ODS de la Agenda 2030. Dentro de cada uno de los ODS se ve la vinculación con las metas y dentro de las metas con cada una de las palabras clave, de estas 4.000 palabras clave que tiene la base de conocimiento de Parlamento 2030. Otra cosa interesante que permite hacer Scanner 2030 es comparar dos textos diferenciados. En este caso, hemos pasado por el Scanner 2030 dos proyectos de ley que se están tramitando en este momento en dos países distintos, en Chile y en España. A la izquierda de sus pantallas tienen el resultado de realizar el análisis del texto de Chile, en el cual podemos ver que prácticamente el 87% del contenido de esta ley está relacionada con el ODS 13 de acción climática. En cambio, en el lado derecho de sus pantallas, el texto español, pueden ver que además de los vínculos obvios con la agenda climática, hay una relación muy fuerte con las políticas energéticas del ODS 7, también con la política industrial del ODS 9 y también con algunas políticas sociales como pueden ser las políticas de empleo del ODS 8 y de ciudades sostenibles del ODS 11. Bien, en definitiva, y por acabar, este tipo de herramientas logran hacer realidad el deseo de que cualquier persona interesada, sin necesidad de tener grandes conocimientos ni grandes medios a su disposición, pueda conocer y entender qué está ocurriendo dentro del Parlamento. Pero no solo esto, también puede ser una herramienta potente en manos de los propios parlamentarios, para conocer qué está ocurriendo a su alrededor, fuera del Parlamento, y también para poder rendir cuentas ante la ciudadanía de qué es lo que están haciendo ellos y ellas para responder a los grandes retos de nuestra época. Muchas gracias por su tiempo y a su disposición para responder a cualquier pregunta que puedan tener. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Javier. And we actually running a bit out of time, but I would like to ask only one question and hope for a short, efficient answer to Dermot. So Dermot, as the assembly took place in 2016-2018, is there anything you would do differently, especially looking at the examples of assemblies which are taking place in the past years, including the French one?
Sure, thanks. Thank you, Elena, for the question. So the biggest limitation in the Irish experience was that there were only 2 weekends devoted to climate change. So as I said, the 2016-18 Assembly was one that considered 5 topics over a period of 18 months, but only 2 weekends were devoted to climate change. And that really wasn't enough time, in my view, and in the view of a lot of observers, to really get into the detail of climate policy. And if we look at the French experience or the UK Climate Assembly, those both gave 5, 6, 7 weeks, weekends over a period of months to the topic of climate change. So that would be the biggest thing that I think other countries should do differently. A more general comment, I think, would be simply for any other countries considering doing this to look at the different models. So as more and more countries do citizens' assembly for climate change, because so other countries can kind of pick and choose and look at the design characteristics of different instances that have been trialed and think through whether and to what extent different design characteristics would fit the political and institutional characteristics of the country in which you're operating. And just one other comment in response to something that a participant put in the chat, mentioning the G1000 in Belgium, which is essentially a kind of a citizens' assembly. Just one clarification on my own presentation. On that slide with the different examples, I was only identifying examples where these processes had focused specifically on climate change. There's a wide range of examples in different jurisdictions around the world of citizens' assemblies and similar processes on a wide variety of topics of public policy. And there was a very good report published by the OECD last year, kind of drawing together our knowledge to date of these processes, which I would recommend to the audience if you want to get an overview of worldwide trends in this area.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dermot, Liz, and Javier for your presentations. We unfortunately have to move on. I see that there are some questions in chat. Please feel free to answer them in written if you wish. And I would like to move to the final session of the day on Parliament's and Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm pleased to introduce you to Kirsten Broswell at Parliamentarians for the Global Goals Organization. And I really ask all the panelists, please keep to 7 or 8 minutes for each presentation. It will be very much appreciated. Thank you so much. Kirsten, please.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to join this session. And I will be broadening the perspective a little bit from climate action to the broader 2030 agenda, which has been my focus since before the SDGs were adopted at the UN. I have a background as a member of parliament in Denmark, serving 4 terms in the National Parliament of Denmark, and also as the Minister for Environment back in 2014 and 15 when the SDGs were being negotiated at the UN. So, of course, took part in celebrating that we were able to adopt such an ambitious agenda for global development. And the fact that all UN member states adopted this agenda is also, I think, what is an important milestone and something that we should all be committed to doing everything we can to implement and achieve. I have been asked to talk a little bit, of course, about my own work in the Danish Parliament around SDG implementation, and then about the organization that I have founded, Parliamentarians for the Global Goals, that works with mobilizing and supporting parliamentarians all over the world who are engaged in SDG implementation. So you can say SDGs were adopted as a part of a UN process, which naturally takes the focus of UN member states and therefore national governments as the main stakeholders and key responsibles for the implementation of the agenda. So naturally the UN processes are very government focused, and the review processes there in the UN system are also aimed at governments that will present on a regular basis their national voluntary national reviews at the high-level political forum in New York. As a member of parliament, there is no sort of permanent hook into that process. It is very much up to the national level whether parliamentarians are included in the voluntary national reviews, and also how governments include legislators in that process. From my own experience in the Danish Parliament, there was no sort of continuous platform or way of engaging with that process. So back in 2017, I founded and chaired the Danish All-Party Parliamentary Group on the 2030 agenda in the Parliament to make sure that we had a forum where we could, first of all, raise awareness about what is the 2030 agenda about and what can the role of parliaments be in that implementation process of this incredibly important and ambitious agenda. And also developing a structure and a setup inside of the parliament, making sure that not only the development cooperation committee, which was the case in the beginning, is discussing SDGs as part of our international cooperation efforts, but also that all standing committees in the parliament take responsibility and make sure that they are part of the accountability and oversight mechanisms towards the government to make sure the government delivers on these promises. This was, we made some important steps there, and sort of one milestone was to have the budget committee in Denmark set up a subcommittee on the SDGs to primarily focus on progress and monitoring of progress. We also initiated an indicator project with Statistics Denmark, and together with our multi-stakeholder platform that we also established back in 2017, we developed a set of national indicators to supplement the global framework of UN indicators, making sure that the agenda, so to speak, is more localized and can be measured with more relevant data and indicators in a Danish context. So just a few examples of the steps that we took there. I've since stepped down from my seat in Parliament to take some of these experiences to a global scale, and that is why I founded Parliamentarians for the Global Goals, an initiative to support parliamentarians all over the world who, just as I was in the Danish Parliament, are working in their national context. It could also be city, state, or regional level parliaments. We invite all levels of government to participate here, but who are keen to learn from others and from their peers, share best practices and experiences about how legislators can work with implementation of the 2030 agenda. We launched the initiative last year at the UN General Assembly SDG Action Zone, and since then we have mobilized 100 parliamentarians from 47 different countries in this network, and we are in dialogue with them about how best we can support them. We have just actually today had the first more formalized meeting with a group in the European Parliament that we have supported And just one example of how we work also to support parliamentarians in their individual parliaments to set up these structures that can help them play their role of oversight and control and accountability mechanisms. So that was sort of in a nutshell what we are working with. But let me finish by just giving a few ideas on how I think parliamentarians can approach this. It can seem like a really big task, but how you can approach the SDGs as a framework for pushing for sustainable development in your parliaments. So one first step is to make sure you have established a very clear structure for SDG oversight in the parliament, which committee or all-party group or subcommittee has the main responsibility. I think that's critical to make sure that there is one place where this is being monitored. And then that committee or group can then help the standing committees also implement a clear structure, identify the relevant targets, and have an annual cycle of how the parliament will make sure to monitor progress and hold governments accountable. And the next step, as I mentioned, in Denmark, we have had this data indicator project where we've identified national indicators. And this is critical because it is part of the framework of the 2030 agenda that all countries must identify their own national targets to be able to make sure that this is not a beauty competition between countries, but it's actually a universal agenda that all countries must address internally and say, how do we want to monitor our progress? Where do we have our respective strengths and weaknesses with regards to achieving SDGs? So these national targets are critical to also for parliamentarians to be able to monitor the progress. And then, of course, key functions of parliamentarians is legislating, passing legislation, and also approving or disapproving of the national budget. So having mechanisms in there for the legislative procedures and the budget cycle to screen that up against the SDG framework is critical. That is a task where you will need to ask your governments to set up a structure or give you some kind of monitoring mechanism. And this has to be developed before then parliamentarians can also make sure that those key elements of parliamentary work, those sort of fundamental tasks for parliamentarians are also seen in an SDG framework. And then finally, my clear advice is also to make sure that you have some sort of multi-stakeholder framework that you can seek a dialogue and advice from a broad group of stakeholders. We cannot achieve the 2030 agenda if we don't work together across sectors and across political parties. So we really need to break down some of those barriers and some of those silos that sometimes are keeping us in each of our corners. We need to come together. And this can happen by establishing some kind of a multi-stakeholder forum where you will have that continuous dialogue with the broader stakeholder environment, which will also help you develop more science-based policies and more sort of community-based solutions for the SDGs that can inform your work as a parliamentarian and improve your legislative and your budgetary work as well. So in a nutshell, that is the experience from my side, as a member of the Danish Parliament and now as the founder of the Parliamentarians for the Global Goals. And I'm of course open to questions and also follow up from anyone who's curious about learning more about the network. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kirsten, for sharing these ideas and recommendations. We will move to the next speaker, Helmut Berger, head of the Budget Office at the Parliamentary Directorate at the Austrian Parliament. Helmut, please, the floor is yours. We cannot hear you yet. Perfect.
So, yeah, okay, so good afternoon again, or whatever time it is in your country. I'm the head, as I have been introduced, of the Austrian Parliamentary Budget Office, and I have the pleasure to give you some information and recent developments we have here in Austria on monitoring the SDGs, but also the climate action that we are following. So I will share my presentation. Okay, do you already see the presentation?
Yes, I can see.
Okay, so the Austrian Parliament deals with the SDGs on several levels and committees, but this is a more recent development. And it started basically with the budget debate 2021. So far, we had no formal structured debate on SDGs, and it was more or less driven by interested MPs that made the SDGs part of their agenda. In December 2020, we had a unanimous resolution on establishing a parliamentary SDG monitoring mechanism, I would say. The parliament is requiring regular reporting of government and also the individual ministries on the progress of SDG implementation to parliament. And these reports should be debated in the respective committees so that it is not a silo form of discussion, but each committee should deal with their share on implementing the SDGs. And what is also quite important, the SDG perspective is part of our budget debate. So it's in a way linked to the budget. And one of the fruits of these developments we see was a report, Austria and the 2030 agenda, that was already submitted in February 2021 to Parliament. And there it was held a discussion in the Constitutional Committee, and the report was adopted in plenary. The other quite strong branch is the Austrian performance budgeting system. Our budget consists of performance objectives, measures to implement these objectives, and indicators to monitor these. And since the budget 2021, each outcome objective in the budget should be linked to a corresponding SDG. And this development has much to do with the work of my office, the Austrian Parliamentary Budget Office, that is supporting basically the budget committee with written expertise, analysis, and short studies. But it also prepares short studies on the request of members of the budget committee, and it should also consult the parliament regarding performance budgeting and gender budgeting. And what is a quite new development, we had a people's initiative on climate. And on following this initiative, there was a resolution of the parliament that the budget office should not only deal with the budget figures, but also should monitor a climate budget and should monitor. Okay, here, yeah, and should monitor and analyze a greenhouse gas budget. So the Parliamentary Budget Office did some analysis in the past, already in connection with this performance budgeting parts and with this performance budgeting. And what was one of the reports we presented to the budget committee was a so we called it SDG landscape. That means that I can show you the example in the next slide, that we use a SDG. Here we have the SDG 13, and we take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. And we looked in what budget chapter we had some the outcomes objectives that are closely linked to these objectives. What were the indicators that we used in our national budget? Were the comparable indicators, SDG indicators? What is our position? What is the development that we see within our budget, and what is the comparison to the SDG development in the EU 28? So these more or less was the model also for the government to then combine the budget objectives with the SDGs, as we saw it in the last budget. And so what were the conclusions that we had on this development? We saw that the SDG integration follows the existing governance structures. That means all the documents that we have already in the budget or in other reports are now more linked to the SDGs. It was used so far as a useful information, but not really used for policy making or oversight. But now with the linkage to the performance information in the budget, this could be a next step. The resolution requiring from government a structured report is an important issue, and the next step could then be to link the objectives more to the budget figures, because budget is the right to vote on the budget is the most important right on the parliament. And so this alignment with the budget and strategic priorities that are the basis for the budget would be one of the issues to bring them on the agenda and to mainstream the SDGs. And so, at least in the Austrian situation, there must be a close cooperation between the Ministry of Finance, because he has here a very important role to play, the Prime Minister, because the Prime Minister is more or less responsible for monitoring SDG implementation, the Parliament and also the line ministries, and we have to combine this to an overall approach of monitoring the SDGs and to bring them in line with all the other instruments we are using for our governance, so to say. That is it in brief, what are the recent developments in Austria.
Thank you so much, Helmut. It was very interesting to learn about your experiences. So now I would like to move to the next speaker of this session. Maria Gabriela Grael, Director of International Relations, Head of the Office for SDGs at the National Assembly of Panama. And I just would like to ask Helmut if you could stop sharing your slides before Maria starts.
Hello, good morning. Sí. Yes, I will share my screen. Okay, I switched to Spanish, okay? Buen día a todos. Gracias a Interpares por esta iniciativa y permitirnos exponer nuestros avances como Asamblea Nacional de Panamá en la lucha contra el cambio climático. Como lo mencionó Elena, soy la directora de Relaciones Internacionales de la Asamblea Nacional de Panamá y encargada de la oficina ODS para la Asamblea Nacional, una oficina estratégica para impulsar los ODS. Quisiera iniciar con este punto antes de compartir nuestros avances con el objetivo ODS 13. Contamos con la Oficina de Desarrollo Sostenible Parlamentario. De esta manera podemos darle seguimiento, visibilidad y estimular la ejecución de la Agenda 2030 desde el Parlamento, apoyando a las comisiones. Al mismo tiempo estamos trabajando con varios parlamentos de la región centroamericana y Caribe con el fin de replicar esta iniciativa en cada país de nuestra área. Gracias al network que manejamos con el Foro de Presidentes y Presidentas de las Asambleas para Centroamérica y el Caribe, la Cuenca del Caribe y México, esto ha sido posible. En este momento estamos trabajando de la mano con México en el Senado para incorporar esta oficina dentro y que pueda promover la Agenda 2030 en las acciones del Senado y de la Cámara de Diputados. Desde la oficina ODS podemos promover la capacitación, el entendimiento y hacer alianzas estratégicas con organismos internacionales para el apoyo de mantener en agenda de los diputados los ODS. De esta manera nos medimos y apoyamos también al gobierno, o sea, al Ejecutivo, con informes propios de nuestra Asamblea, con el único fin de legislar en favor de no dejar a nadie atrás. Luchar contra el cambio climático o contrarrestar los efectos drásticos a la afectación del planeta, producidos en gran parte de la falta de conciencia de millones de personas y crecimiento desproporcionado de la población, entre otras de sus causas, es responsabilidad de nosotros y todos los que entendemos la realidad de estos desastres. Panamá es un país con gran biodiversidad, abundancia de peces y aves, y por su naturaleza es un país rodeado de 2 mares, lo que representa su principal activo. Por lo tanto, es una prioridad en la acción de producir protección y concientizar a la población para ello. El Canal de Panamá y nuestros puertos son los que mantienen la economía del país, y cualquier situación que perjudique al clima afecta directamente a nuestra economía. Es lamentable que solo se hable del cambio climático cuando hay derrumbes, inundaciones, crecidas de río y que no sea una planificación constante o preocupación de muchos. En este sentido, debemos agradecer a la existencia de los Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible, que son una guía valiosa, que unifica y pone en evidencia que el mundo vive los mismos problemas, pero en diferentes escalas. Y escuchar cómo otros países combaten el cambio climático es una oportunidad para los países como el mío, que aún tienen mucho que aportar al planeta. Por lo tanto, hoy quiero hablarles de lo más relevante del Parlamento panameño que estamos trabajando para aportar un granito de arena a la guerra contra el cambio climático. Necesitamos aliados para acortar pronósticos. Por lo tanto, estamos trabajando con el Parlamento Latinoamericano y Caribeño, el Parlatino, y la ONU sobre una ley modelo de contaminación marina. Lo que buscamos es lograr establecer un marco jurídico en la región para la adopción de las políticas y medidas necesarias para lograr o mantener en condiciones salubles el medio ambiente marino, a través de su planificación, conservación, protección y mejora. Este 2021, desde el Parlamento, se está trabajando en un proyecto de iniciativa, la movilidad eléctrica en el transporte terrestre. Los fines últimos de esta política pública son la reducción de emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero, la reducción y el crecimiento de la movilidad eléctrica de la República de Panamá y el uso de energías renovables como herramientas de transición energética en los sistemas de transporte terrestre. Hemos adoptado algunas leyes, y esas ya para culminar, algunas leyes modelos para nosotros que son como leyes insignias de nuestro Parlamento. Y una de las que tenemos es promover el uso de bolsas reutilizables en establecimientos comerciales, que regula la reducción y el reemplazo progresivo de los plásticos de un solo uso. Esta ley es pionera en la región. Hemos estado promoviendo para que otros países también la adopten. Hemos hecho leyes de reducción de uso de papel en la gestión pública, una realidad en las instituciones gubernamentales, que es la falta de medición que permite valorar la eficiencia y la productividad durante décadas. Hemos estado acostumbrados a no controlar los gastos asignados a las distintas instituciones públicas y esta problemática incide en el uso excesivo de papel, el cual no solo impacta en las finanzas públicas, sino también en el consumo desmedido de los recursos naturales, como es la tala de árboles. Y por último, quería hablarles sobre la ley que impulsa el reciclaje. Es algo también que hemos promovido durante estos últimos meses. Es que introduce una nueva legislación en conceptos de reducir, reutilizar y reciclar, que establece la gestión integrada de residuos sólidos en las instituciones públicas. Tiene como objeto reducir la generación de residuos sólidos como el papel, cartón, latas de aluminio, tetrapack, botellas plásticas, etc. Estas son algunas de las prácticas que vemos como caso de éxito para nosotros. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias, and thank you so much for your presentation. I can see that Kirsten already kindly was answering quite a few questions in the Q&A box. And actually we have time maybe for one question, which was originally asked to Kirsten, but Maria, I would like to ask it to you. So could you please tell us how does your parliament engage young people in policy formulations and implementation processes regarding the SDGs implementation?
Muchas gracias por la pregunta, Elena. Tenemos varias formas de sensibilizar a la juventud o incluir a la juventud en el Parlamento. La Asamblea Nacional de Panamá tiene asambleas juveniles, donde hacemos un simulacro de parlamento para jóvenes, incluimos a diferentes colegios y se sesiona exactamente igual como si fueran diputados reales. Se tratan de promover proyectos, insignias, por lo menos con el tema del cambio climático, es uno de ellos. De esta manera incluimos a la juventud para entender el proceso de legislar en nuestro país.
Thank you so much. I think it's very important also for Interpares, as one of our cross-cutting priorities is also youth engagement. So I think as I don't see any other questions coming, I would like to thank you, three of you very much, you, Kirsten, Helmut, and Maria Gabriela, for your time and for your excellent presentations, ideas, and recommendations. And I think we're ready to move to the final part of the conference, and I encourage everyone to stay for this final session where we'll recap learning from the virtual conference, and we will propose next steps in sharing international parliamentary innovations on climate change action. And first of all, I would like to invite Oras Tinkinen, the former member of the Finnish Parliament and Interpares climate consultant.
Thank you, Elena, and thank you again to all of our great speakers. Yesterday, we approached climate action from the perspective of different parliamentary functions, such as legislation, budgeting, and oversight. Today, we have dived into cross-cutting topics like regional and global cooperation, citizen engagement, and SDGs. I think the discussions yesterday and today put together provide a really powerful package of ideas and tools for parliaments to use. So if you were not able to join us yesterday, I would really strongly recommend watching the recording of the sessions, which is available. I'm hearing the French interpretation. Let me just switch that off. Let me try to very briefly highlight some of the key learnings I would leave the conference with.
Apologies, I also can hear French interpretation in the English channel. Could you please fix that? Thank you. Please continue, Oras.
I'm a big fan of the French language. It's a very beautiful language, even though I don't really understand much of it. So I would like to briefly try to highlight some of the learnings, at least I would take away from this conference. First, climate is really a democracy issue, and democracy is really a climate issue. And this is often forgotten and neglected in public policy debates, I would argue. On the one hand, climate crisis really damages the functioning of democracies if it's not really tackled properly. And on the other hand, democracies have many of the best tools available to tackle the climate crisis. So it goes both ways. And to ensure the effectiveness and permanence and sustainability of climate action in the long term, we also need to make sure that these climate measures have democratic legitimacy. A second takeaway for me would be that parliaments really do play an indispensable role, and we have kept hearing about this throughout the day today and also yesterday. I think one nice way to summarize it was that the parliaments have 3 Ps: purse, policy, and pronouncement. But you could also say that parliaments have both moral and constitutional authority. They have both formal and informal political influence. And it's not only about declarations and statements. Parliaments can also deliver like we saw in the case of the European Parliament pushing the whole European Union for more climate ambition. But to do this, parliaments need to take a leadership role, and they need to challenge the status quo, and they need to keep pushing the boundaries of what is possible and feasible. Third, and this is a point I raised already yesterday, is that we do have many concrete tools available for parliaments and parliamentarians. We heard yesterday about many of them. Today, we learned about, for instance, how the members of the European Parliament are included in EU delegations to climate negotiations at the UN climate conferences. We heard about the annual climate reporting in a very understandable fashion to the Parliament here in Finland. We heard about various networks of parliamentarians covering Latin America, the Mediterranean region, even globally. We heard about the super committee formed in the UK Parliament, looking at the preparations for the next really important UN climate conference. And we heard about the citizens' climate assemblies, most specifically in Ireland and France, but also in many other countries. And of course, how the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, are being monitored and followed in various parliaments, including in Denmark and Austria. I would like to end with something we heard in the beginning of this conference today, which is from the keynote speech of Saber Chowdhury, when he was talking about the declaration made by the Bangladeshi parliament. That declaration calls for declaring a broader parliamentary emergency, so not only climate emergency. And many other speakers today highlighted that we really need to link climate with other pressing issues of our time: biodiversity loss, disasters, social justice, and many others. And the Sustainable Development Goals really provide one really good framework to do this. I found one part in the Bangladeshi declaration really pertinent. The declaration says that the parliaments need to protect and fortify our planet, the only home we have. And I think that is really a good mission for all of our parliaments. And with this, I would like to hand over to Jonathan Murphy.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to the speakers in the last session, all of the speakers today, and all of the speakers yesterday. I'm just going to make a few comments to follow on from Oras's excellent summary. Some of the takeaways that I had today were that the need for a long-term approach and the fact that that doesn't necessarily fit with parliamentarians having a cycle, an election cycle that would be normally between 3 and 5 years. Oras was too polite, but Finland also has a great example in its Committee for the Future, which attempts and succeeds in taking a long-term approach to policy issues in general. But of course, they have focused particularly on climate issues and sustainability issues. I also very much appreciated from Saber Chowdhury the idea of an accountability summit. And we heard yesterday of the brilliant work of the Bundestag, but also of the French Parliament, and there are many other parliaments equally holding government to account. And I think there's room to expand that work in the area of climate change, to share experiences on accountability on climate change, and really to establish a system whereby we're each trying to outdo each other in terms of more effective action on climate change. And I think parliamentarians have a major impact, can have a major impact, as Oras has suggested. And another area which perhaps we should have focused on, particularly had a specific session on, was the role that parliamentarians can play in global action. We have, of course, COP26 coming up this year in Scotland, And there are a number of activities that are being organized in relation to COP26, including many of our partners, including, of course, the Interparliamentary Union. And I think we should not underestimate the role that parliamentarians have as a tribune. Finally, another cross-cutting issue that several people mentioned was COVID-19, the need to build back greener, not to be tempted to build back by reverting or letting go of the targets that we have committed to, and that we need to actually enhance and make stronger. So I think, again, that's a role that parliaments can play in ensuring that need to continue the focus on climate change as we build back from COVID is critically important. What are we going to do next with the work of this conference? First of all, I hope that it has been very, very useful for all of you, for the participants, for the speakers in sharing ideas. We brought ideas from all over the world. I've learned a great deal, both in preparing for the conference and also in listening to the excellent speakers and reading and hearing the questions that all of you have asked. But we're not going to just leave it there. The next step for our work at Interpares on climate change is to pull together these brilliant examples, these excellent case studies that we've heard over the past 2 days, and to create a toolkit which we believe will be very helpful for parliaments, both our partner parliaments around the world, parliaments in emerging democracies, and parliaments in Europe, within the European Union and around the world, that will address all of the different areas we've covered today, and that represent Parliament's impact on policy throughout the cycle. So Parliament, going back to our very first sessions on Parliament's role in climate legislation, government oversight, on the budget process and making sure that climate is accounted for properly in the budget process, representation of citizens. We had an excellent, a very interesting session today, and there's a lot more work that needs to be done and will be done in engaging citizens in all kinds of different ways, from citizen assemblies to many other techniques, to ensure citizens are part of this work against climate change, and that parliaments play this role of the connection between citizen and the state, which is what parliaments are really about. And we will also, of course, in this toolkit, include these critically important areas of work that we have looked at today. Europe, the way in which parliaments have played a key role in establishing and insisting upon assuring that the Green Deal, the Green Agenda, is at the center of the European Union's planning and governance strategy over the next period, and also a process that can be extended to other regions in the world. The Sustainable Development Goals, the brilliant work that Kirsten is doing, and of course the very, very interesting examples that Maria Gabriela brought us from Panama, where the Panamanian Parliament, and I know Maria Gabriela herself has really been a force for ensuring that that Parliament takes its place in the Sustainable Development Goals, and Helmut's really interesting and I think unique work in Austria on integrating the Sustainable Development Goals in performance budgeting in Austria. And finally, last but not least, the excellent examples that we had of interparliamentary networking. We had 3 very different case studies, very different types of interparliamentary networking that allow ideas to be transfused across countries, and again, to build on this idea that is in fact what Inter Pares is about, what our project aims to do, which is to enable peer-to-peer learning and strengthening of parliamentary institutions as a way of strengthening democracy. And in this particular conference, in this particular context, the focus, of course, on climate change and what can parliaments do in order to lead the battle to combat climate change. I'd like to just make the last few words if we could share the slide. And so first of all, to say my special thanks to the Climate Change Reference Group. This is a group that really helped us to plan this conference and to plan our whole strategy on climate change. It includes representatives from the Assembly of the Portuguese Republic, from the Czech Republic Chamber of Deputies, the Danish Parliament, the Finnish Parliament, the French National Assembly, and the German Bundestag. And we would not have been able to put on this conference to bring together these brilliant speakers without tremendous support from that group. And also part of this group and a great partner of Inter Pares, the Interparliamentary Union. And from the Secretary General who spoke at our opening event to all of the members of the climate team at the IPU, you've been a fantastic support. I'd like to thank all of our speakers. You have really enriched not just my last 2 days, but the months in which we have been organizing, and I've learned so much, and I hope that all our participants have learned from you, and I thank you very, very much. Many of you got up early in the morning or took time out of a super busy schedule to share your knowledge, and I know that both we at Inter Pares and the people around the world who are listening in and watching will make good use of that knowledge. We thank, as always, the European Union, which provides all of the funding for Inter Pares, and which is also a fantastic strategic partner. And we thank International IDEA, which hosts and delivers the Inter Pares project. And again, we really appreciate all the support we get from International IDEA. And particularly, I'd like to thank our Secretary General for an excellent opening speech. And I know International IDEA is committed over and above its work with parliaments to ensure that the climate change democracy agenda is brought forward as a major institutional priority, as International IDEA's main institutional priority. I would like to thank the Inter Pares team. In front of the screen, particularly Elena Botanina, who has carried the whole 2 days of the conference, has done a brilliant job. We have people behind the screen, too many to talk about, but many of you speakers and participants will have met them. Thank you very, very much for all of your work. Thank you, Horace, for your excellent summary and consulting from your expert perspective. And above all, I'd like to thank all of you, the conference participants. You're the people we wanted to bring to this conference. We had over 500 registrants for the conference. We're really delighted. We look forward to any feedback, any criticism, any advice, any suggestions for future work, and we look forward to seeing you very, very soon. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for your kind words. Thank you, Horace, for your short presentation. And we are ready to finish. I also join the thanks to all the participants for being here with us, all the speakers, and have a lovely day or evening wherever you are. And thank you again for joining us. You can find some very important links on your screen, and an email with all the relevant information will be following shortly in the next days. Thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you very much to the interpreters, of course, as well.